The words hung in the air, heavy and metallic, like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Colonel Rains stood by the door of the secure briefing room, her hand resting on the heavy steel handle, looking at Emily Carter with an expression that was hard to read. It was a mixture of professional detachment and something far more personal, something that looked suspiciously like regret. "You have 4 hours," Ree said. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the bass. For a moment, it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Emily didn't blink. She didn't move. She just absorbed the weight of the deadline. 4 hours to decide whether to walk back into a life she thought had been stripped away from her, or to stay on the ground and watch the world burn from the safety of the sidelines. And Carter, the colonel, stopped, her voice dropping an octave. Emily looked up, meeting the older woman's gaze. "What?" Rain seemed to choose her next words with unusual, almost surgical care. Her eyes darted toward the overhead cameras for a split second before returning to Emily. "The intelligence picture on this compound in the Korangal is classified well above my level," she admitted. "I've only been told what I needed to tell you to get you to the table. But the analyst who briefed me, a woman I've known for a decade, said something that didn't quite sit right." She paused, the hesitation palpable. "She said the compound's security posture changed 48 hours ago. Specifically, 12 hours before the ambush on the convoy." Emily stood there, the floor beneath her boots suddenly feeling less like solid concrete and more like a sheet of thin ice over a deep, dark lake. That single fact began working its way down through the layers of her mind, past the tactical analysis and the mission geometry, settling into the place where her instincts lived. She understood immediately what it implied. It was a jagged, ugly thought, and she wasn't yet willing to say it out loud, because saying it would make it a reality. If the compound's defenses had tightened 12 hours before the generals were taken, it meant the ambush wasn't a lucky break for a group of insurgents. It wasn't opportunistic. It was planned. It was a precision strike executed with advanced, intimate knowledge of the convoy's route, its timing, and its vulnerability. "Rains," Emily finally said, her voice a low rasp. "I know," the colonel replied, her face hardening. "Who else knows about that detail?" Emily asked. Rains shook her head slowly. "Very few people, and that's all I can tell you. The security protocols on this are tighter than a drum." Rains pulled the door open, and the harsh, artificial light from the corridor spilled into the darkened room, cutting a sharp diagonal across the floor. 4 hours, Carter. I'll be in my office. If you're in, I need your signature on the activation orders. If you're out, go back to the fence." Rains left, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. Emily stood alone in the briefing room for a long moment, the silence rushing back in to fill the space. Outside, the muffled thunder of jets continued. It was the soundtrack of Nellie's, a constant, low-frequency vibration that most people eventually tuned out, but Emily lived by it. She could track the sound without looking, her mind automatically calculating the angle of the engine nozzles and the thrust-to-weight ratio. The pitch told her the power setting. The specific timing of the fade told her the aircraft was climbing fast, turning east toward the range. She knew all of that without thinking about it. She knew it the way she knew how to breathe, a physical literacy that had been hard-coded into her nervous system over thousands of hours in the cockpit. She walked to the door and stopped, her hand resting on the cold metal frame. Somewhere in the Korangal, in a compound built into the jagged eastern ridgeline where the shadows stayed long even at noon, 2 4-star generals were sitting in whatever darkness their captors had seen fit to put them in. And somewhere much closer, somewhere inside the very same system that had grounded Emily Carter for the crime of saving 12 lives in a Syrian desert, someone had told the enemy they were coming. Someone had sold them out. She stepped out into the corridor. The air in the hallway felt cooler, but it didn't help the rising heat in her chest. She had 4 hours, but in reality, she was already deciding. Beneath the tactical calculations and the flight physics, a single cold question had begun to burn with the quiet, persistent intensity of a pilot light. If someone inside had given up the convoy, and if the Pentagon had specifically reached past General Holt to pull her out of exile, then who exactly was this mission really designed for? Was she being asked to rescue 2 generals, or was she being sent into that canyon for an entirely different reason? She walked faster, her boots echoing against the linoleum. Emily had exactly 4 hours, and she wasn't going to spend them pacing. She spent the first 20 minutes doing nothing but sitting in the empty pilot-ready room. It was a space she hadn't been allowed to enter for a month, smelling of stale coffee, Nomex, and the lingering scent of high-altitude oxygen. She sat with her hands flat on her knees, staring at the blank white wall, letting her mind run the numbers the way it always did when a situation moved from difficult to genuinely dangerous. Not the manageable kind of dangerous that they taught you in flight school, and not the calculated risk kind of dangerous you dealt with on a standard sortie. This was the kind where the margin between success and catastrophe was so thin you could cut your soul on it just by thinking about it. 70 feet of clearance, 340 knots, 3 high G turns, 4 kilometers of canyon. She ran the simulation in her head again and again, visualizing the rock walls closing in, the way the air would compress beneath her wings, the way the ground effect would try to buck the nose up at the exact moment she needed to stay low. Each time, the math came back the same way. It was survivable, but only barely. It would require every single variable to align perfectly. More than that, it would require the pilot behind the stick to operate at a level that most people in aviation would have described as physiologically impossible. Your hands would have to move before your conscious mind could process the visual input. Your body would have to trust the physics of the air the way most people trust gravity, not by thinking about it, but by having internalized it so completely that the reaction was automatic, pre-verbal, animal. She believed she could do it. That wasn't arrogance. She had no room for ego anymore. It was the cold, accurate self-assessment of a woman who had spent 900 hours pushing herself to the edge, learning exactly where her limits were, and understanding that the Korangal Canyon, while terrifying, sat just inside them. Barely, dangerously, but inside. What she could not calculate, however, was the other thing. The thing Rains had dropped into the room like a live grenade and then walked away from. The compound's security posture had changed 12 hours before the ambush. Someone had told them the convoy was coming, and the Pentagon had gone around General Holt to reach her directly. Those two facts sat together in her mind like two magnets with the same polarity, pushing against each other, refusing to settle. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. She crossed the room and pushed open the door, walking down the corridor toward the intelligence section. If she was going to make a life-or-death decision in the next 3 hours and 40 minutes, she was going to make it with as much information as she could scavenge. Sergeant First Class Daria Okonkwo was the senior intelligence analyst on the Nellie's day shift. She was a sharp, quiet woman from Atlanta who wore her hair in a braid so tight it looked painful and who communicated almost exclusively in precise, declarative sentences. She didn't like fluff, and she didn't like being interrupted. She looked up when Emily came through the door, her expression remaining perfectly neutral, which told Emily everything she needed to know. Okonkwo had already been briefed on the situation. She knew why the grounded captain was standing in her vault. "Tell me what you can," Emily said, pulling up a chair across from the high-resolution monitors that dominated Okonkwo's desk. The screens showed a satellite feed of the Hindu Kush, a landscape of jagged peaks and deep, shadowed valleys that looked like the surface of a hostile planet. Okonkwo glanced at the heavy, sound-baffled door, then back at Emily. Her voice was a low murmur. "I can tell you what's unclassified at your current clearance level, Captain, which isn't much." "Then tell me that," Emily countered. Okonkwo sighed, tapping a few keys. "The Korangal compound has been active for approximately 6 weeks. It was flagged as a possible insurgent logistics node by imagery analysis 3 weeks ago. At the time, no action was taken because the threat assessment was moderate, and the valley's terrain made any kinetic option extremely high risk." She paused, looking Emily in the eye. General Walsh and General Park were traveling under a cover itinerary. They were in civilian vehicles with no military markings, moving on a route that had not been used by coalition personnel in 11 months. They were ghosts, but they knew anyway, Emily said, her voice flat. The compound's defensive posture shifted 12 hours before the convoy moved, Okonkwo said, her words carefully measured. "That is a fact in the official intelligence record, which means someone with access to the itinerary told them," Emily finished the thought. Okonkwo said nothing, which in the world of intelligence was a screaming confirmation. How many people had access to that itinerary? Emily asked. "I can't answer that," Okonkwo replied. "Can't or won't." Okonkwo's voice remained quiet but became very firm. "There are things I am not able to tell you in this room at this clearance level, Captain. What I can tell you is that the number of people who knew the full itinerary was small, deliberately small. The investigation into the leak is active, but it's being handled by a level of internal affairs that doesn't talk to people like me. She leaned forward slightly, her chair creaking. What I can also tell you is that the request for your involvement did not originate from the standard search and rescue coordination process. It didn't come through the usual channels at CENTCOM. It came from a specific individual at the Pentagon who bypassed the entire chain of command. General Morse, Emily said. Something shifted in Okonkwo's face. It wasn't surprise exactly, but a kind of sudden recalibration, like a lens clicking into focus. You already know. Rains told me it came through Morse's office. What I don't know is why Morse specifically. What's her connection to this? Why would a deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs even know my name, let alone reach out for me while I'm under administrative review? Okonkwo sat back, looking at the ceiling for a moment as if searching for the right words. When she looked back at Emily, she had the expression of someone who had decided to say one true thing and nothing more. General Morse was General Walsh's commanding officer 15 years ago in the 10th Mountain Division. They go way back. In the circles they run in, Walsh is the reason Morse has a 4th star. He saved her career during a particularly messy operation in the Balkans. She paused. That's all I'm going to say about that. Emily stood up, the weight of the conspiracy feeling heavier with every new detail. Thank you, Daria. Carter Okonkwo stopped her as she reached the door. Emily turned back. Be careful what you agree to. Not every mission is what it says it is on the briefing slide. I know, Emily said. And for the first time in a month, she felt the familiar, cold clarity that usually only came to her at 20,000 feet. She walked out. She was in the corridor, moving fast toward the communications room when her path was suddenly blocked. It wasn't a person at first, but a door opening directly in front of her, swung wide with enough force that she had to sidestep and brace herself against the wall to avoid a collision. Through the door came Major Alan Dawson. Dawson was General Holt's golden boy, the pilot who had been expected to dominate the tactical evaluation 18 months ago. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd been born for the uniform, tall, blonde, with a jawline that belonged on a recruiting poster. He'd had the best scores in the squadron until Emily had walked in and systematically dismantled every record on the board. He had never forgiven her for that. He had never forgiven her for being better than him without even trying to be, and he certainly hadn't forgiven her for the Syria incident, which he viewed as a stain on the entire wing. He saw her and stopped. They just looked at each other for a long, tense beat. The hallway felt suddenly much narrower. Carter, he said. His voice was light, easy, and conversational, the precise tone of a man who was working very hard to sound like he didn't care about something he cared about enormously. I heard you're getting a special audition. I don't know what you're talking about, Dawson, Emily said, trying to move past him. He stepped to the side, blocking her again. Really? Because I heard Rains pulled you into the vault this morning, and I heard the comm section has been fielding calls from DC since 0300. He tilted his head, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes were hard and cold. I also heard they ran the Canyon simulation at Bram. 6 pilots, 6 of the best we've got. Nobody made it. They all smeared themselves across the rocks. Emily looked at him steadily, her face a mask of indifference. So you want to know why they're not asking me? The lightness in his voice cracked just slightly, the bitterness bleeding through. I have more flight hours than you. I have a better evaluation record, the corrected record at least after the board review. I have General Holt's full endorsement. I'm the one who should be leading any extraction mission coming out of this base. Dawson, she said, her voice calm and lethal. If you could fly that canyon, they'd be asking you. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the corridor. She watched the words land on him. She watched him process them, reject them, and then process them again. His jaw tightened so hard she could see the muscle pulsing. Something moved through his eyes, something complicated and ugly and very human. It was the look of a man who knew he was being left behind. You're going to get yourself killed, he said, his voice dropping to a hiss. And when you do, I want you to remember that you could have stepped back. You could have let someone qualified handle it. Someone who actually understands the rules. Someone qualified, she repeated, looking at him for one more second. Her gaze didn't waver. Excuse me, Major. She walked around him, and this time he didn't try to stop her. She didn't look back to see him watching her go. She didn't need to. She could feel his resentment like a physical heat on her back. The communications room was 2 corridors away, and she covered the distance in less than 90 seconds. The air in this part of the building was different, humming with the sound of high-powered servers and the frantic energy of people handling information that could change the world in a heartbeat. The duty communications officer, a young airman named Petty who couldn't have been more than 22, looked up as she approached. He had the wide-eyed expression of someone who had been told to expect a hurricane. "Colonel Rains said you'd be coming, ma'am," Petty said, his voice tripping over itself. "Secure line is available in room 3. The call is already scheduled. You just have to pick up." Emily stopped, her hand hovering over the door handle of the small, soundproof booth. "The call is already scheduled." "Yes, ma'am. Whoever's on the other end has been holding for about 40 minutes. She absorbed that. Someone had been waiting for her on a secure line for 40 minutes. That meant they hadn't just been waiting for her to make a decision. They had been confident enough in her decision to schedule the call before she'd even spoken to Rains. It was a level of certainty that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. She went into room 3 and closed the heavy door. The room was tiny, barely big enough for a desk and a chair, with acoustic foam padding every inch of the walls. On the table sat a secure handset, its small red light blinking with steady, mechanical patience. She took a breath, letting it out slowly, and then she picked it up. "Captain Carter," said the voice on the other end. It was a woman's voice. It was measured, precise, and carried the particular kind of effortless authority that doesn't need volume to make itself felt. It was the voice of someone who was used to being the most powerful person in any room she entered. "This is General Patricia Morse, Deputy Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Thank you for picking up." "General," Emily said, her own voice steady. "I'm going to be direct with you, Captain, because we don't have time for anything else," Morse said. "You've been briefed on the situation in the Korangal. You know about the 2 flag officers. You know about the canyon approach, and I suspect you've already run the numbers in your head, and you know you can do it." "I've run the numbers," Emily said carefully, "but numbers on a page are different from air under the wings. I'd need to see the full terrain data and the current radar coverage maps before I could give you a confident assessment of the success probability. Those are already being prepared for you. You'll have the packet within the hour," Morse replied. There was a brief pause, a moment of silence that felt like a bridge being built. "I need to ask you something directly, Captain, and I need a direct answer. Not a careful answer, not a military answer. A direct one, all right. Do you trust your own judgment more than you trust the system that just grounded you?" The question hit Emily somewhere she hadn't expected. It wasn't because it was surprising, but because it was so precisely the right question. It was the question she had been circling around for 31 mornings at that perimeter fence. It was the question underneath the anger, underneath the frustration, underneath the physics. She thought about the 12 soldiers in Syria, the men who were alive today because she had broken the rules. She thought about General Holt's voice echoing in the hallway, dismissive and cold. I don't care what she did out there. She thought about Okonkwo's face when she warned her that not every mission is what it seems. "With respect, General," Emily said, her voice hardening. "That's not the question I'd ask myself." A pause. "What question would you ask?" "I'd ask whether the mission is real." The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. Emily counted them by the beat of her own pulse. "Explain," Morse said. "The compound's security posture changed 12 hours before the ambush," Emily said, laying it out. "That's in the intelligence record. Whoever planned this ambush knew where those generals were going before they even left the wire. That means this wasn't random. It wasn't an insurgent group getting lucky. It was a targeted abduction. And then the Pentagon contacts me specifically, going around my base commander and the entire chain of command, to ask a grounded pilot to fly a mission that 6 other qualified pilots couldn't even finish in a simulator." She took a breath, her knuckles white around the handset. "So yes, General, I trust my judgment. But my judgment is telling me to ask what I'm really being sent into that canyon to do. Because rescuing 2 generals is one thing. Being used as a piece in a game I don't understand is another." Another silence followed, longer this time. When Morse spoke again, her voice had changed. It was still controlled, still authoritative, but something underneath it had shifted, a very slight lowering of the professional distance. It was the way a person's voice changes when they decide to stop managing a conversation and start actually having one. "The generals are real," Morse said. "They are in that compound right now, and their lives are genuinely at risk. That is not a fabrication, Captain. I can promise you that on my honor." A pause. "But you're right that there are layers to this mission that go beyond the rescue. I can't tell you everything on this line. What I can tell you is that there are people within the intelligence apparatus who have been waiting to identify a specific capability. A pilot who can fly that canyon for reasons that have nothing to do with Walsh and Park. Emily's hand tightened on the phone. They're using the rescue as a test. We believe someone is, Morse admitted. Someone is looking for a proof of concept. To identify whether I specifically can fly the approach. That is our assessment, which means Emily stopped, the logic clicking into place with the cold finality of a bolt sliding home. Finish the logic, General, which means if I fly this mission, whoever set this up knows exactly what I can do. I become a known quantity. I become a target. You were already a target, Morse said quietly. The grounding was not random either, Captain. Think about the timing. Holt grounds you 31 days ago. 2 weeks later, the Korengal compound goes active. 1 week after that, the ambush happens and 2 4-stars are taken. And then the Pentagon, specifically my office, is forced to reach out to the one pilot who can fly the approach. A pilot who has been conveniently isolated from operational duties, whose movements are therefore highly predictable, and who is desperate enough to get back in the air that she might not ask too many questions. Morse let that sit for a moment. Someone has been building a scenario. We don't know exactly who yet, but we know the scenario requires you. Emily stood very still. She could feel her own heartbeat, which was unusual. She was a person who lived in a state of controlled calm, but now she felt the adrenaline spiking, the familiar fight or flight response, but refined into something sharper. "So I'm being set up," she said. "You're being tested," Morse corrected, "by someone who needs to know if you can survive what they are planning to send you into next. The Korengal mission is a proving ground. If you die in the canyon, they have their answer. You weren't good enough, and they move on to the next candidate. If you survive and extract the generals, they know exactly what you're capable of." "And then?" Emily asked. "And then they come for me?" "That is our working theory, yes." Emily breathed in and out. Measured, controlled. This was the breathing she used in the cockpit when the master caution light was flashing and the ground was rushing up to meet her. It was the discipline of slowing down the world so you could see the gaps in the fire. "General, why are you telling me this? If you need the generals out, why risk me saying no by telling me I'm walking into a trap?" "Because the generals are real," Morse said, "and because you are the only person who can get them out, and because I will not send a soldier into a trap without telling them it's a trap." There was a pause, a moment of profound gravity. "I also need you to understand something else, Captain. If you go into that canyon and you come back out, you will have proven yourself to whoever is watching. That means we will know they're watching, and that gives us something we currently don't have. It gives us a thread to pull." Emily understood. She wasn't just the rescue pilot. She was the bait. But there was a difference between being a worm on a hook and being the hook itself. Bait that knows its bait is a weapon. "I need the terrain data," she said, her voice now completely devoid of doubt. "I need the radar coverage maps, the full intelligence picture on the compound's layout, and I need the extraction team composition and their communication protocols. Everything. I want to see the maintenance logs for the bird I'll be flying. I want to know who fueled it and who armed it. You'll have all of it within 90 minutes, Morse promised. And Holt." A pause that contained a great deal of unspoken political maneuvering. "General Holt will be informed of the mission after you are airborne," Morse said. Not a second before. Emily let out a slow, jagged breath. "He's going to try to end my career after this, regardless of how it goes. He'll call it a breach of protocol. He'll call it insubordination." "Possibly," Morse said. "But 2 4-star generals who owe their lives to you tend to be very useful people to have on your side when a 1-star is trying to bury you." For the first time, something in Morse's voice approached warmth. It wasn't quite there, but it was the shadow of it, the respect of one professional for another. "Captain Carter, I have read every evaluation, every performance record, every flight log you have produced in your career. I know what you are capable of. The only question I have been sitting with since 3 o'clock this morning is whether you know it." Emily looked at the blank, padded wall of the secure room. She thought about the fence, the cold coffee, and the long, empty days of watching the planes take off without her. She thought about Dawson's face in the corridor and the look of small-minded fear in his eyes. "I know it," she said. "Good," Morse replied. "Then let's get 2 generals home." The line went dead with a soft, final click. Emily set the handset back on the cradle, her hand steady. She stayed in the small, cramped room for a moment, just breathing. The 4-hour clock was still ticking, but the decision was made. She wasn't a grounded pilot anymore. She was a mission-essential asset, She opened the door and stepped back out into the humming energy of the communications center. Airman Petty looked up, his eyes wide. "Ma'am, get me a secure terminal," Emily said, her voice sounding like the snap of a whip, "and find Colonel Rains. Tell her I'm signing the orders." The next 90 minutes were a blur of high-intensity preparation. The intelligence packet arrived exactly as Morse had promised, a digital landslide of topographical maps, infrared signatures, and intercepted comms. Emily sat in a corner of the vault, her eyes moving with predatory focus over the screen. She memorized every bend in the canyon, every potential site for an anti-aircraft battery, every thermal pocket that could affect her lift. She was no longer thinking about the betrayal or the test. She was thinking about the air. She was thinking about the way the wind would shear off the jagged peaks of the Korangal, and how the narrowness of the gorge would create a Venturi effect, sucking her toward the walls if she wasn't careful with her throttle. She was calculating the exact moment she would need to dump her flares and the precise angle of her bank to keep the radar from locking on. Colonel Rains came in an hour later, dropping a thick folder on the table. The activation orders. "Sign here, here, and here." Emily signed without looking up from the terrain map. "You're really doing this," Rains said. It wasn't a question. "Someone has to," Emily replied. Rains leaned against the table, her voice dropping so the other analysts couldn't hear. "I just got word from the hangar. They're prepping the bird you requested. The ghost frame. It's been sitting in the back of the shed for 6 months. Why that one? Because its electronic warfare suite is 2 generations ahead of what Holt's squadron is flying," Emily said. "If I'm going into a radar-rich environment with a leaked itinerary, I want the skin that's hardest to see." Rains nodded slowly. "You're thinking like a survivor, Carter. That's good. Keep doing that." "I'm thinking like a pilot, Colonel. There's no difference." As the final hour approached, Emily found herself back in the ready room, pulling on her flight suit. The Nomex felt familiar, like a second skin she had missed. She zipped up her boots, adjusted her G-suit, and checked her survival vest. Everything was in its place. Every buckle, every strap, every piece of gear was a part of her. She looked at herself in the small, scratched mirror on the locker door. Her face was pale, her eyes dark with the intensity of the task ahead, but there was no fear. There was only the cold, sharp edge of purpose. She was going into a canyon that had killed better men than Dawson. She was going into a trap set by people who viewed her as a data point. But she was also going back to the sky. She grabbed her helmet and walked out of the ready room, her footsteps steady and rhythmic. She didn't look at the other pilots as she passed. She didn't look for Dawson or Holt. She didn't need their validation anymore. She reached the hangar doors and felt the first gust of desert air, hot and smelling of JP-8. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the tarmac. And there, sitting on the edge of the apron, was the aircraft, sleek, dark, and lethal. It looked like a predator waiting for the signal to strike. Emily Carter walked toward it, the 4-hour clock finally hitting 0. The mission was a test. The mission was a trap. The mission was a betrayal. But as she climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit, feeling the familiar embrace of the seat and the cold touch of the controls, she knew one thing for certain. They had no idea what they were about to unleash. The handset clicked into its cradle with a finality that seemed to echo in the small, cramped office. Emily stood there for a long moment, the silence of the room pressing in on her, thick with the weight of the decision she had just made. The air felt heavy, charged with a sudden, sharp electricity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. There was no going back now. The invisible line had been crossed, and the path ahead was narrow, dangerous, and entirely of her own making. She took a single, steadying breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs, and then she turned. She opened the door and stepped back into the corridor, her boots striking the linoleum with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. The transition from the quiet of the office to the controlled chaos of the flight line was jarring. The heat of the Nevada sun hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside, the shimmering haze rising off the tarmac in waves. The air was thick with the smell of JP-8 fuel and the high-pitched whine of pneumatic tools. She moved with purpose, weaving through the activity, her eyes scanning the rows of aircraft until she found Martinez. He was elbow-deep in a pre-check on Jet 9, his frame shadowed by the massive curve of the intake. He looked like a man who was part of the machine itself, a vital component of the steel and circuitry that kept the base alive. When she came up beside him, she didn't say a word at first. She just waited. Martinez sensed her presence, a sixth sense developed over years of working in high-pressure environments. He pulled his head out from the access panel, a smear of grease across his forehead, and looked at her. He didn't see the grounded pilot he had known for the last month. He saw something else entirely. He read the tension in her jaw, the terrifyingly calm focus in her eyes, and he straightened up completely, the wrench in his hand forgotten. The chatter of the flight line seemed to fade into the background as they locked eyes. "Jet 6, she said, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that demanded absolute attention. "Full combat load. I need her ready in 2 hours." Martinez stared at her, his eyes searching hers for some sign of a joke, some indication that this was anything other than what it sounded like. But there was nothing but stone-cold intent. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper against the distant roar of a departing transport. "I need her ready in 2 hours, Martinez," she repeated. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't offer an excuse. She simply stated the requirement as if it were a fundamental law of physics. Martinez looked around the flight line, his gaze darting to the security towers, the operations building, and back to her. He stepped closer, dropping his voice into a range that only she could hear. "Carter, if Holt finds out I prepped your jet without authorization, I'm done. My career is over. Your career is over. We'll both be sitting in a brig before the sun goes down. The authorization is coming," she said, her voice steady, from above Holt. Martinez narrowed his eyes, his skepticism thick enough to touch. "Above Holt? Who's above Holt that's talking to you?" "Way above," she said. She held his gaze, her expression unyielding. She was asking him to jump off a cliff with her, and they both knew it. This wasn't just about a mission anymore. It was about trust, the kind of trust that was forged in the cockpit and tempered on the flight line over decades. "Can I count on you?" Martinez was quiet for a long moment. He was a man who had spent 16 years on flight lines, a man who had seen the best and worst of the Air Force. He had prepped aircraft for routine training missions, and he had prepped them for desperate, midnight scrambles that never saw the aircraft return. He understood in his bones what it meant when a pilot looked at you with that particular expression, the one that was completely calm and completely committed at the same time. It was the look of someone who had already accepted the consequences of their actions. He looked down at his hands, then wiped them slowly on his work cloth, the dark fabric soaking up the grease. He looked back at Jet 6, then back at Emily. 2 hours, he said, his voice firm now, the hesitation gone. "She'll be ready." Emily nodded, a sharp, quick motion of her head. She turned to walk away, then stopped. "Martinez," she said without turning back to face him, "if anyone asks, you haven't seen me." She heard him make a sound that was almost a laugh, a dry, gallows humor chuckle that spoke of a shared secret. "Carter, I haven't seen you since 0600 this morning. As far as I'm concerned, you're still in your quarters nursing a grudge." Emily didn't reply. She just kept walking, her mind already shifting to the next phase of the operation. She headed toward the operations building, her pace brisk. The clock was ticking, and every second she spent on the ground was a second closer to the moment the window of opportunity would slam shut. The data package from Morse would be waiting for her. She knew the protocol for these things. The encrypted servers, the secure terminals, the layers of digital protection that guarded the kind of information that could start or end wars. Terrain maps, radar coverage, compound layouts, it was all going to be there, waiting to be dissected. She had 90 minutes to study it, 2 hours to wheels up, and somewhere between the scorched tarmac of Nevada and a jagged, unforgiving canyon in Afghanistan, someone was watching. She could feel it, a presence in the peripheral vision of her mind. Someone was waiting to see exactly what she could do, testing her, probing for a weakness, or perhaps just observing the inevitable collision of her will and the world's reality. She was going to show them. She was going to show all of them. And then, when they thought they had their answer, when they thought they had her measured and filed away, she was going to make sure they deeply regretted ever asking the question. The data package arrived in exactly 93 minutes. It was a testament to Morse's efficiency, or perhaps the urgency of the people he represented. Emily was already in the secure briefing room, a windowless box filled with the low hum of cooling fans and the smell of ozone. Petty, the duty officer whose eyes always seemed to see more than he let on, slid the drive across the scarred metal table without a word. He didn't ask for her clearance. He didn't ask why a grounded captain was in a secure vault requesting high-level intelligence. He just left, closing the heavy steel door behind him with a soft thud that signaled the beginning of her isolation. He understood that what was about to happen in that room required a silence that the rest of the world couldn't provide. Emily plugged the drive into the terminal, and the screen flickered to life, bathing her face in a harsh, blue glow. She pulled up the terrain data first. The canyon rendered in topographic detail, a digital recreation of a place she had never been but would soon know better than the back of her own hand. It was narrow, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. It was a geological fault in the earth that looked from the overhead imagery like a wound that had never properly healed, a jagged scar carved into the rugged skin of the Hindu Kush. She studied it for 11 minutes without moving, without blinking more than was absolutely necessary. She wasn't just looking at the map, she was inhabiting it. She was committing the 3 critical turns to muscle memory, the way a musician commits a difficult high-stakes passage to their fingers. She wasn't thinking about the notes, she was letting the shape of the music settle into her body. The first turn, 23 degrees left, beginning at kilometer 1.4. The canyon walls at that point were at their widest, providing 90 feet of clearance. On paper, it felt almost generous, but Emily knew better. She knew that 90 feet at 340 knots was a lie. At that speed, the walls would feel like they were reaching out to grab her, the margin of error measured not in feet, but in the fractions of a second it took for a human heart to beat. It was a tolerance so tight that a sneeze or a sudden gust of wind could end everything. The second turn, 31 degrees right at kilometer 2.8. This was where the canyon turned from a challenge into a trap. The walls narrowed here to 70 feet. This was the kill point. This was the exact spot where 3 of the 6 simulation pilots had died, their virtual lives ended by a momentary lapse in focus or a micro-adjustment that came just a millisecond too late. Emily looked at the topographic profile of the turn, the way the rock face jutted out like a jagged tooth, and felt something that was not fear but was adjacent to it. It was a heightened physical awareness, a sharpening of her senses, her body preparing itself for something it understood was real and lethal. The third turn, 18 degrees left at kilometer 3.6. After that, 400 meters of straight approach, a brief moment of stability before exiting into the valley approach corridor for target acquisition. It was a gauntlet designed to break a pilot's resolve before they even reached the objective. She moved on to the radar coverage maps. The situation was grim. 2 SA-24 sites were positioned on the ridge lines, their coverage fields overlapping like a pair of predatory eyes. The canyon approach threaded between them by a margin that had been calculated by someone at the Pentagon using very expensive, very sophisticated modeling software. The margin was real, but it was paper thin. If she stayed below the canyon rim for the entire approach and exited at the precise angle the data specified, she would emerge into the valley behind the radar coverage cone of the eastern site. From that moment, she would have approximately 11 seconds. 11 seconds to acquire the target and neutralize the compound's external defense positions before the extraction helicopter crossed into the radar range of the enemy batteries. 11 seconds. It was an eternity in a dogfight and a heartbeat in a ground attack. She pulled up the compound layout. Guard positions were marked in angry red icons. 2 external weapon emplacements on the south wall. 1 mobile patrol last observed on the northern perimeter, likely a technical with a heavy machine gun. The generals were being held in a structure on the eastern side of the compound, a small, reinforced building separated from the main complex. It was a tactical anomaly. Either their captors were being cautious about keeping high-value prisoners isolated from the main garrison, or it meant something else, something more sinister. She filed that thought away, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, not yet deciding what to do with it but refusing to ignore it. She scanned the extraction team composition. Delta Force, 8 operators under the call sign Saber 6, led by a master sergeant named Reeves. She had never worked with him, but his record was a litany of high-stakes successes. 12 years in special operations. 4 prior extractions from denied access terrain. He was a man who understood that close air support in confined spaces required more than just skill. It required an absolute, unbreakable trust between the pilot in the sky and the team on the ground. According to his record, he had never once second-guessed a pilot who was doing the job correctly. He was exactly the kind of man she needed on the other end of the radio. She closed the drive, the screen going dark, and sat for a moment in the sudden gloom. She could feel the vibration of the bass through the floor, a low-frequency hum that seemed to match the thrumming of her own pulse. She stood up, opened the door, and found Petty still standing there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "Get me a direct line to Sabre 6, she said. Petty blinked, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "They're already in country, ma'am. Forward staged at Jalalabad. They're under strict calm silence." "I know where they are and I know the protocol," Emily said, her voice dropping an octave. "Get me the line. Now." Petty looked at her for a long beat, then nodded slowly. He knew when to follow the rules, and he knew when the rules were being rewritten in real time. 4 minutes later, Emily was standing in a small communications booth, the air smelling of warm electronics. She was on a scratchy, encrypted voice channel with a man whose voice sounded like gravel being processed through a very tired, very old machine. "Sabre 6, this is Viper Lead," she said, using the call sign that had been assigned in the mission package. "I need 3 minutes." "Go ahead, Viper Lead," the voice crackled back. No hesitation. No preamble, no "who is this?" Or "why are you calling?" She liked him immediately. "I've reviewed the compound layout," she said, her voice crisp. "The generals are in the eastern structure, separate from the main building. I want to know if your pre-mission intelligence accounts for the possibility that they've been moved since the last satellite imagery." There was a pause on the line, not the pause of someone who didn't know the answer, but the pause of a professional deciding exactly how much of the ugly truth to share. "Imagery is 14 hours old," Reeves said. "We've accounted for the possibility. Contingency Plan B puts us on the eastern structure first, regardless of what the latest overhead says. We hit the target, we verify, we move." "Good," Emily said. "Second question. The mobile patrol on the northern perimeter. If it moves to the southern side during my approach window, I may not be able to neutralize it before you're on the ground without risking the extraction zone. How do you want to handle that?" "We handle it ourselves," Reeves said, his tone flat and certain. "Your job is the emplacements and the radar suppression. My job is everything inside the wire once you've opened the door. You don't worry about what I can't see. I don't worry about what you can't reach. We stay in our lanes and we get the job done. Understood?" She paused, the weight of the mission pressing down on her. "Reeves, one more thing. Go. I'm going to be very fast through that canyon," she said. "When I come out the other side, I will have 11 seconds before the Eastern SA-24 comes back into play. I need you to understand that 11 seconds is not a suggestion. It's a hard limit. The moment I tell you the door is open, you move. Not in 2 seconds, not when you're ready. Immediately." Another pause. When Reeves spoke again, there was a new quality in his voice, a thin thread of respect that she recognized. It was the particular kind of respect that special operations personnel extended to exactly 2 categories of people. Other special operations personnel and pilots who talked like they actually understood the visceral reality of what they were asking a ground team to do. "Copy that, Viper Lead," Reeves said. "We move on your call, see you on the other side." She terminated the channel and the booth fell silent. She looked at her watch. 1 hour and 12 minutes to wheels up. She needed to get to the flight line. She needed to be in that cockpit. She was halfway down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor of the operations building when the door at the far end opened and General Holt walked through. He wasn't alone, but his presence seemed to fill the entire space. He was in his service dress uniform, which was the first red flag. Holt only wore service dress for meetings with senior visitors or congressional delegations. It was a Tuesday morning on a forward operating base. There was no reason for him to be in anything other than his flight suit or working blues. He had clearly come from somewhere official, or was about to go somewhere official, and he had clearly not expected to see her. When he registered her presence in the corridor, his face went through 3 distinct expressions in less than 2 seconds. Surprise, then recognition, and finally something cold and calculating that settled over his features like a mask being lowered into place. He stopped walking. Emily stopped walking. There were 15 feet of empty corridor between them, but it felt like a vast, impassable chasm. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice echoing slightly against the tiled walls. "General," she replied, her voice neutral. His eyes moved over her with the clinical precision of a raptor. He took in the flight suit, her posture, the direction she was heading, straight toward the hangar doors. All of it was feeding into whatever complex calculation he was running. Holt was not a stupid man. That was the thing about him that made him genuinely dangerous rather than merely unpleasant. He was intelligent, he was disciplined, and he was absolutely convinced that his way was the only way. Men who are smart and wrong are far more destructive than men who are simply foolish. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Flight line, sir." "You are grounded, Captain. I believe I made that point exceptionally clear in my office. I'm aware, sir. Then explain to me why you are in a flight suit heading toward the flight line when you should be in your quarters awaiting a formal review. Emily held his gaze. She had promised herself that when this moment came, and she had known since the secure room that it was coming, she would not flinch, she would not be apologetic. She would not give him the satisfaction of watching her fold under the weight of his rank. I've been given a mission assignment, General, she said. The authorization is coming through official channels. You'll be briefed. I will be briefed now, he said, his voice dropping into that surgical register she remembered all too well. It was a voice colder than a shout, a voice that was designed to cut through any defense. By you, in my office. Right now, General, I don't have time. That was not a request, Captain. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere behind her, she could hear the faint, rhythmic sounds of the operations center, the clacking of keyboards, the murmur of radio chatter, the ordinary noise of an airbase doing its daily work. It felt like a different world, a world she no longer belonged to. She thought about the 11 seconds. She thought about Reeves and his team sitting at Jalalabad, checking their gear, waiting for a pilot to thread a needle in a canyon that everyone else said was impossible. She thought about 2 generals in an eastern structure in the Korangal Valley, men whose lives depended on her being in the air, not in an office. Sir, she said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. With respect, I am going to the flight line. My orders come from above your authority level, and they are time-critical. You will be informed through the appropriate channels in due course. She paused, taking a step forward. I understand that this is going to make you angry. I understand what that anger will mean for me when this is over. And I am going to the flight line anyway. Holt stared at her, his face a mask of rigid discipline. But for a split second, the mask cracked. Not with rage, which she had expected, but with something else. Something that looked briefly and unmistakably like recognition. It was as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a subordinate to be managed, but as a peer who had made a choice he himself might have made once, a long time ago. The clarity of it seemed to surprise him. Then the mask came back, harder and colder than before. You are making the worst mistake of your career, he said. Yes, sir, she said. Possibly. She walked past him. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked at the measured, deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and is no longer in any doubt about it. She didn't look back to see if he was watching her. She didn't stop until she was through the heavy double doors and out onto the flight line. The Nevada sun hit her face again, but this time it felt different. It felt like a herald. She could see Martinez 30 meters away, standing next to Jet 6 with his arms crossed. He didn't wave, he didn't signal, but his posture said everything she needed to know. The aircraft was ready. She suited up in 8 minutes. It was a ritual of precision, every movement governed by the deep physical memory of 900 hours in the air. The helmet, the harness, the oxygen connections, the comm check. It was all automatic, a dance she had performed 1,000 times. Her hands moved over the aircraft with the particular intimacy of a pilot who knows a specific jet. She knew its quirks, the way the throttle had a tiny bit of play in it, the way the cockpit glass had a slight distortion in the lower left corner. It wasn't just a machine. It was an extension of her own body. Martinez watched her work, his face unreadable. When she was done, he stepped close to the cockpit, the roar of nearby engines making conversation nearly impossible. Anything you need me to tell anyone after you're up? He shouted over the noise. Emily thought about it. She thought about the bridges she had burned and the people she was leaving behind. Tell Rains I said thank you, she shouted back. Martinez nodded, a sharp, grim movement. Come back, Carter, working on it, she said. She climbed into the cockpit, and the canopy slid shut, sealing her in a world of glass and electronics. The outside noise faded to a muffled hum, replaced by the familiar symphony of the F-35's internal systems. She ran the startup sequence, her fingers dancing across the touchscreens. She felt the aircraft come alive under her, the vibration, the pressure, the particular quality of sound as the engine first caught and began its powerful, rhythmic build. It was a sound she associated with every good thing that flying had ever given her. She was on the radio immediately, coordinating with the tower under the mission call sign. The tower, which had clearly been briefed by someone with a very high clearance, cleared her for immediate taxi without the standard procedures. She was rolling in 4 minutes, airborne in 6. The moment the wheels left the ground and the landing gear tucked into the belly of the jet, something inside Emily Carter shifted. It was a feeling she didn't have words for and didn't try to find. She had been earthbound for 31 days, stuck in a world of gravity and politics and paperwork. Now, the physics of lift, the sudden, glorious pressure of acceleration, and the vast, open sky unfolding before her felt like a homecoming. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was something more fundamental, the sensation of being returned to the element she was built for. She pushed the throttle forward and climbed, the desert floor falling away beneath her. The flight to Afghanistan was long, a journey through time zones and over oceans, but she spent most of it inside the sanctuary of her own mind. She ran the canyon approach over and over, visualizing every turn, every rock, every shift in the wind. She wasn't doing it with anxiety. She was doing it with the focused repetition of an elite athlete. She talked to Reeves twice during the transit. He was already in position, his team staged 2 kilometers south of the canyon entrance, hidden in the shadows of the rugged terrain, waiting for her call sign. 40 minutes out from the canyon entrance, a new voice appeared on the mission frequency. It wasn't Reeves and it wasn't Morse. It was a voice she didn't recognize, cold and professional. Viper Lead, this is Watchdog. I'm reading a second fast mover in your airspace, bearing 270, closing at approximately 400 knots. Not one of ours. Emily's hands tightened on the stick, her knuckles turning white. Watchdog, say again, second fast mover. Confirmed, unknown aircraft, no IFF response, closing on your position from the west. Current intercept calculation puts them at your location in approximately 18 minutes. She ran the numbers instantly. 18 minutes. That put the unknown aircraft at her position right at the canyon entrance. Right at the moment she would be committed to the approach, when pulling out was no longer an option and her speed and attention would be entirely consumed by the terrain. Someone was timing this very precisely. Watchdog, can you identify the aircraft type? She asked. Negative, the voice replied. Radar profile is inconsistent. Could be modified external configuration. Changes to confuse type identification. Emily held the frequency for a moment, the silence of the cockpit suddenly feeling very heavy. She thought about what Morse had said back in Nevada. Asterisk, someone has been building a scenario. The scenario requires you. Asterisk, she thought about what it meant that an unidentified aircraft was closing on her at exactly the speed and bearing to arrive at the canyon entrance at exactly the moment she would be most vulnerable. This was not a coincidence. This was the second layer of the test. The canyon was the physical challenge, but the unknown aircraft was the consequence of passing it. Watchdog, she said, maintain tracking. Do not engage unless fired upon. I am continuing to target. Copy, Viper Lead. Be advised, if he maintains current closure rate, he will be within weapons range approximately 40 seconds after you exit the canyon. 40 seconds after exit. The math was brutal. She would have 11 seconds to neutralize the compound's defenses and cover the extraction helicopter. Then she would have less than 30 seconds to deal with an armed, unknown aircraft that someone had positioned specifically to kill her when she was most exposed. She breathed, counting to 3, letting the calculations settle in her mind. Saber 6, Viper Lead, she said. Reeves was on immediately. Go. Change of picture, she said. There is an unidentified aircraft closing from the west. He will be in weapons range approximately 40 seconds after I exit the canyon. After I open the door on the compound, I will have a very hard time budget. You need to be off the ground with the package in 80 seconds, or I cannot guarantee coverage. There was a pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. 80 seconds, Reeves said. No questions, no complaints. We'll be ready. I know you will, she said. She dropped to low altitude as the terrain began to rise toward the eastern mountains. The world began to blur as she descended, the brown and gray of the Afghan landscape rushing beneath her. She could see the shape of the valley system ahead, the ridge lines that held the SA-24 sites, and the narrow, dark gap that was the canyon entrance. 3 minutes out, she pushed the throttle forward. She felt the aircraft accelerate, the speed building smoothly, 300, 320, 340. She held it there. It was the number she had lived with for 12 hours. 2 minutes out, she checked her weapon systems, all green. Targeting was already confirmed on the 2 external emplacements at the compound. The mobile patrol position was unchanged, still on the northern perimeter. Everything was in place. 1 minute out. The canyon entrance appeared in her HUD, a dark, jagged crack in the mountain face. She didn't hesitate, she didn't pause. She didn't give herself the fraction of a second that doubt requires to take root. She went in. The world narrowed instantly. Everything became the canyon. The walls on both sides were no longer abstractions on a map. They were real, immediate, and enormously present. They were a physical fact that her body registered in a way that no simulation could ever fully prepare her for. The sheer scale of the rock, the way the shadows played across the stone, the way the air seemed to compress around the jet, it was overwhelming. The clearance was terrifying. At 340 knots, the rock walls were a blur of gray and brown, passing so close she felt like she could reach out and touch them. The first turn came at her faster than she expected. 23 degrees left. She rolled the jet, the G-force pulling at her, pinning her into the seat. The canyon walls seemed to tilt, the horizon disappearing as she carved through the gap. She stayed low, the terrain following radar screaming in her ears, a constant, high-pitched reminder of how close she was to disaster. The second turn was approaching. The kill point, 70 feet of clearance. She saw it, the sharp jut of the rock face, the narrowest part of the gauntlet. She took a breath, held it, and committed. She banked the jet hard to the right, the wings overlapping the shadows of the canyon walls. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the roar of the engine and the terrifying proximity of the stone. She felt the air turbulence buffeting the aircraft, a violent, shaking force that tried to push her into the wall. She fought it, her hands moving with a precision that was beyond thought, a pure expression of will. She cleared the turn. Third turn, 18 degrees left. She hit it perfectly, the jet responding to her touch like a living thing. And then the straight approach, 400 meters of narrow, stone-walled hallway. She could see the exit ahead, a bright doorway of light leading into the valley. Sabre 6, Viper lead, door is opening. Now, she burst out of the canyon like a shot from a gun. The world expanded instantly, the wide valley floor spreading out beneath her. She didn't look at the scenery, she didn't look at the mountains. Her eyes were locked on the HUD, target acquisition. 11 seconds. The compound was there, a cluster of mud-walled buildings nestled against the ridge. She saw the red boxes of the weapon emplacements. She didn't wait for a lock. She fired. 2 missiles streaked away from the jet, their trails of white smoke cutting through the dusty air. They hit their marks with a deafening roar, the explosions blooming like dark flowers on the compound walls. She banked the jet, scanning for the mobile patrol. There it was, a truck with a mounted gun, racing toward the eastern structure. She lined up the strafe, the cannon fire erupting from the nose of the F-35 in a rhythmic, devastating thrum. The truck disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. Defenses neutralized, she said, her voice tight with the strain of the G-forces. Sabre 6, the door is open. Move, she looked at her clock. 10 seconds had passed. She banked hard, pulling the jet into a steep climb to stay beneath the radar cone of the second SA-24 site. Her eyes darted to the radar screen. The unknown aircraft was there. It was no longer a distant dot. It was a threat closing fast, its signature finally resolving into something recognizable. It was a modified Su-35, a heavy-hitting interceptor that had no business being in this airspace. 40 seconds to weapons range. Below her, she saw the extraction helicopter, a dark shape skimming the valley floor, heading for the compound. Reeves and his team would be hitting the eastern structure now. They had 80 seconds to find the generals and get them to the bird. Emily leveled the jet, her eyes switching between the ground and the sky. She was the only thing standing between the extraction team and 2 very different kinds of death. One was a radar-guided missile from the ridge line, and the other was a highly maneuverable interceptor coming out of the west. She pushed the throttle to the wall, the afterburners kicking in with a jolt of raw power. She had to stay low to avoid the SA-24, but she had to build enough energy to engage the Su-35 when it arrived. It was a delicate, dangerous balance, a game of chicken played at Mach 1 with the mountains as the backdrop. "Watchdog, I have visual on the fast mover," she said. "He's coming in hot. Copy, Viper lead. You are clear to engage if threatened." Threatened, she thought, a grim smile touching her lips. "He's been threatening me since I left Nevada." She watched the timer. 60 seconds since the door opened. Reeves should be inside the structure. 50 seconds to the intercept. The Su-35 was beginning its descent, carving through the air with a predatory grace. It was looking for her. It was looking for the kill. She checked the compound one more time. The helicopter was hovering near the eastern building, its rotors kicking up a massive cloud of dust. She could see the small, dark figures of the operators moving with frantic efficiency. They were on the clock. She was on the clock. The whole world was on the clock. 30 seconds to intercept. The Su-35 banked, its nose swinging toward her. It was a challenge, a clear statement of intent. Emily didn't wait for him to make the first move. She pulled the stick back, the F-35 screaming as it clawed for the sky, breaking the radar floor and daring the SA-24 sights to find her. If she was going to fight, she needed room to move. The radar warning receiver in her cockpit began to wail, the high-pitched, panicked scream of a missile lock. But it wasn't coming from the ridge. It was coming from the Su-35. "He's got a lock," she whispered to herself. She didn't dive. She didn't run. She turned into the threat, the two jets closing the distance at a combined speed that defied the human brain's ability to process. 10 seconds. "Reeves," she shouted into the radio. "Get out of there. Package is secure." Reeves' voice came back, sounding remarkably calm amidst the chaos. "We are wheels up in 5. Emily saw the flash from the Su-35 wing. The missile was away, a streak of white fire heading straight for her. She waited, counting the heartbeats, her hand hovering over the flare release. Now. She punched the flares and broke hard to the left, the G-force slamming her into the side of the cockpit. The missile followed the heat of the flares, exploding behind her in a spectacular burst of orange and black. She didn't stop. She kept the turn going, coming around on the Su-35-6. The enemy pilot was good. He rolled the jet, trying to overbank and force her to overshoot. But Emily knew this aircraft. She knew its limits, and she knew how to push past them. She used the F-35's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to hang in the air, the jet shuddering on the edge of a stall, and then she dropped her nose. She had the lock. The tone in her ear was steady, a beautiful, lethal sound. She squeezed the trigger. The Sidewinder left the rail with a roar she could feel in her teeth. It didn't miss. The Su-35 erupted into a fireball, the debris raining down onto the Afghan mountains like falling stars. Emily didn't watch it fall. She dove back toward the valley floor, her eyes searching for the extraction helicopter. There it was, a small, dark shape racing away from the compound, heading for the safety of the border. Sabre 6, Viper lead. The sky is clear. "Get them home. Copy that, Viper lead," Reeves said. "See you back at the barn." Emily leveled the jet, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede, leaving her with a cold, hollow clarity. She looked at the wreckage of the compound behind her, the smoke rising into the clear blue sky. She looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip toward the mountains. She had done it. She had threaded the canyon, neutralized the target, and survived the intercept. She had passed the test. But as she turned the jet toward the west, heading back toward the long flight home, she knew that the real battle was only just beginning. Holt was waiting. The people who had built the scenario were waiting, and they were going to have a lot of questions. She reached up and adjusted her mask, the rhythmic sound of her own breathing the only noise in the cockpit. She wasn't afraid of the questions. She wasn't afraid of the consequences. She had found the one thing that no one could ever take away from her, the knowledge of exactly what she was capable of when the world demanded everything. The F-35 cruised through the darkening sky, a lone predator in a world of shadows. Emily Carter sat in the center of the machine, her hands light on the controls, her eyes fixed on the distant stars. She was a pilot. She was a warrior, and she was finally truly free. The reality of the situation didn't just exist in Emily's mind. It was vibrating through the soles of her boots and the tips of her fingers. 70 feet was no longer a number on a display. It was a physical state of being. At 340 knots, the jagged, sun-scorched walls of the canyon moved past the F-35 in a terrifying, rhythmic blur that her conscious mind simply couldn't process. If she had tried to think about the speed, she would have crashed. If she had tried to calculate the distance between her wingtips and the granite teeth of the cliffs, she would have been dead before the thought finished forming. Instead, she surrendered herself to the machine. She wasn't just flying the jet. She was inhabiting it, operating entirely from a reservoir of deep, physical knowledge she had spent 900 hours building. This was the place where muscle memory replaced logic, where the nervous system of the pilot fused with the avionics of the multi-billion-dollar aircraft. The first turn was coming up, a sharp 23 degrees to the left. Her hands moved before the decision ever reached the front of her brain. It was an instinctive twitch, a subtle pressure on the stick that translated into a precise, physical bank. The aircraft responded with an immediacy that felt like an extension of her own skeleton. The wings threaded the narrow geometry of the turn with a clearance she didn't bother to measure. To measure it would have required conscious attention, a luxury she couldn't afford when the margins were being tallied in inches. She felt the slight increase in G-force, the way the airframe groaned under the sudden shift in momentum, and then she was through. 2.4 kilometers remained. The radio crackled, the voice of the watchdog controller cutting through the roar of the air. The signal was clear but urgent. They were tracking an unknown aircraft, a bogey that had suddenly accelerated. The revised intercept window was now 32 seconds after her canyon exit, 8 seconds earlier than the original calculation. In the high-stakes world of aerial combat, 8 seconds was an eternity. It was the difference between a clean getaway and a missile up the tailpipe. Emily didn't panic. She simply filed the information away in a quiet corner of her mind and kept her eyes on the ribbon of floor ahead of her. The second turn was a 31-degree snap to the right. As she approached it, she felt the canyon beginning to tighten. It wasn't just a visual perception. It was a physical sensation, the air pressure shifting as the walls crowded in like a hand slowly closing around the aircraft. This was the crux of the route, a section where precision was either perfect or fatal. There was no middle ground, no room for a good enough performance. The wingtips cleared the jagged rock by a distance measured in feet that she refused to count. Every input she made was a blend of reflex, instinct, and the laws of physics working in a perfect, high-speed harmony. Her hands remained absolutely steady, her grip firm but not suffocating. Her breathing was controlled, a rhythmic cycle designed to keep her oxygen levels stable even as her heart rate climbed. It wasn't the frantic spike of a person in fear. It was the disciplined elevation of an elite athlete at the peak of performance. Over the frequency, a voice broke through the static. "Saber 6, this is Viper Lead. We are go. Repeat, we are go on your call." The message was for Reeves, the man on the ground, the man whose life depended on her hitting her marks with the surgical precision of a scalpel. Then came the third turn, an 18-degree shift to the left. As she navigated the bend, the canyon finally began to open up. 400 meters ahead, she could see the exit, the harsh, white light of the valley beyond spilling into the dark shadows of the gorge. This was the moment of transition. She pushed the throttle forward to military power, feeling the raw, unbridled surge of the engine as the jet accelerated to 360 knots. Even before she cleared the final rock formation, the compound acquisition was already happening within her targeting system. The two external emplacements, which had been mere icons on a digital map minutes ago, resolved into real, physical targets. The clock was ticking. 11 seconds. She cleared the exit and fired just 3 seconds later. The first emplacement vanished in a bloom of fire and debris. 6 seconds after exit, the second emplacement was gone, neutralized before the enemy even realized they were under attack. But as she scanned the ground, she realized the tactical picture had shifted. The mobile patrol hadn't stayed put. They had moved to the southern perimeter, abandoning the northern position they were supposed to be guarding. She had exactly 1 second of her mission budget remaining. She didn't hesitate. She slewed the targeting pod south, slaving the weapons system to the new coordinates and released. The patrol position disappeared from her situational awareness at the exact moment the clock hit 0. "Doors open," she signaled. "Saber 6, move now." Moving, Reeves replied. His voice was unsettlingly flat, a monotone that betrayed none of the chaos he was likely standing in. It was the same quality Emily heard in her own movements, the controlled, total commitment of a professional who had prepared for every contingency and was now simply executing the plan. But the reprieve was short-lived. 32 seconds until the unknown aircraft reached weapons range. Emily pulled the F-35 into a hard, climbing turn, trading her excess speed for altitude as she put distance between herself and the compound. Her eyes flicked to the radar. The bogey was there, bearing 265, closing the gap with predatory speed. She had 26 seconds to act. She used every one of them to maneuver, twisting the jet through the sky to deny the unknown pilot the clean intercept geometry his approach had been designed to achieve. She climbed, she turned, she dipped, forcing him to constantly recalculate his solution. At 18 seconds, the sky changed. A bright flash signaled a missile launch. Her system screamed a warning, the cockpit filling with the urgent, rhythmic chirping of an incoming threat. She was already moving. Countermeasures deployed automatically, a cascade of flares and chaff blooming behind her like a metallic cloud. She drove the aircraft through a defensive break that was violent and immediate, pulling a sustained 8 GTKs through the turn. The G-suit clamped down hard against her legs and abdomen, forcing blood back toward her brain to prevent a blackout. The world outside the cockpit began to spin, the horizon rotating through orientations that would have left any untrained observer hopelessly disoriented. But for Emily, after 900 hours of learning to think while the world spun, it was just another day at the office. The missile went wide, 30 meters wide. The detonation was close enough that the shockwave rattled the F-35's frame, a shuddering reminder of how close she was to the edge. 14 seconds. Viper lead, this is Sabre 6, the radio crackled. We have the package. Repeat, we have both packages. Moving to extraction point. Both generals alive, moving. Relief flickered in her chest, but it was quickly snuffed out by the reality of the threat still in the air. Emily rolled the aircraft, pulling the nose around until it was pointed directly at the unknown hunter. He was close now, close enough that her targeting radar was painting him with crystal clarity. On her displays, she could see he wasn't breaking off. He wasn't maneuvering to escape. He was holding his course, a sign of either supreme confidence or a suicidal commitment to getting a second shot off. In the time it takes to blink, she made her decision. She designated the aircraft as a hostile threat and fired. The unknown pilot was good. As soon as her missile left the rail, he broke hard to the left. The missile tracked, its internal brain calculating the lead. He deployed countermeasures, high-quality, military-grade flares that burned with an intensity that told Emily everything she needed to know. This wasn't a local insurgent with a surplus jet. This was someone backed by a nation-state. The missile lost its lock, seduced by the flares, and went ballistic, disappearing into the distance. Now they were locked in a turning fight, a low-altitude dance of death over the jagged eastern mountains of Afghanistan. Below them, the extraction helicopter was still 3 minutes away from the compound. 2 four-star generals were on the ground, their lives hanging in the balance, waiting for the threat in the sky to be resolved. Emily didn't have 3 minutes. She didn't have time for a prolonged dogfight where energy and altitude were slowly bled away. She thought about her options for exactly 1 second. Then she did the one thing the other pilot would never expect. She stopped turning. She leveled her wings and flew straight at him. Full power, nose down slightly to build maximum airspeed, she charged head-on. It was the most aggressive, most dangerous choice available in the tactical manual. It was a game of chicken at supersonic speeds. It violated every defensive doctrine ever written, and because of that, it was the correct move. A pilot who fires on a grounded rescue mission and then engages in a turning fight expects his opponent to play by the rules. He expects them to keep turning, to try and get on his tail. He does not expect them to charge like a bull. The unknown pilot blinked. He broke left and dove hard, his nerves finally fraying as the F-35 roared toward him. In that desperate break, he gave Emily exactly what she had been fishing for, a turning exposure. His aircraft moved into a predictable arc, exposing its belly and its heat signature. Her weapon system tracked him smoothly, the tone in her headset turning into a solid, high-pitched scream. She fired from 2 kilometers out. The missile did not miss. A ball of fire erupted against the backdrop of the eastern ridgeline. The unknown aircraft disintegrated, its remnants tumbling into the rocky terrain below. Emily pulled up, leveling the jet and performing a rapid sweep of her systems. The aircraft was intact. Her primary weapons were depleted and her fuel state was nominal. She was okay. Watchdog Viper lead, she said, her voice steady. Unknown aircraft is down. Confirm. Confirmed, Viper lead, the controller replied, a hint of awe in his voice. Target down on the eastern ridgeline. No shoots observed. She took a long, shaking breath, the first real breath she'd had since entering the canyon. Sabre 6, Viper lead, what's your status? Reeves came back on the line. His voice was the same as it always was, flat, controlled, the voice of a man for whom success and failure sounded identical until the mission was over and the debrief began. Extraction complete. Both packages aboard. 3 minutes to collection point. Nobody left behind. Emily closed her eyes for 2 seconds, letting the words settle. 2 generals were alive. The mission had succeeded. Good copy, Sabre 6, she said. Good copy. She turned her aircraft toward the collection point, holding her altitude and keeping a watchful eye on the radar. The mission wasn't over until Reeves' helicopter cleared the valley and the generals were in the hands of a surgical team. Emily Carter was a professional. She didn't stop covering her people until the job was finished. But as she flew, a question began to burn in the back of her mind. A fire that had started in a secure briefing room at Nellie's and was now growing into a conflagration. It was getting louder because of what she had just seen. That aircraft hadn't stumbled upon her. It had been positioned with surgical precision. It had arrived at the canyon exit at the exact moment she was most vulnerable. Someone had sent that aircraft. Someone had known her approach route. Someone had known her timing and her exit point. To have that kind of information, someone needed access to the mission plan. And Emily had left Nellie's less than 4 hours ago. The helicopter carrying Reeves and the two generals cleared the valley at 14 minutes past the hour. Emily watched the small, clean signature on her radar as it moved northeast toward the collection point. It dropped below the ridgeline, slipping out of the threat envelope and into safety. She held her orbit for 4 more minutes, her eyes scanning the empty airspace, running through the threat picture one final time to ensure no other ghosts were hiding in the clouds. Finally, satisfied that the sky was hers, she turned the nose of Jet 6 toward the west and began the long flight home. The cockpit was suddenly, jarringly quiet. That was the one thing about the aftermath of a high-stakes mission that nobody outside of aviation ever seemed to understand: the silence. Once the adrenaline begins to metabolize and the immediate danger passes, the aircraft becomes a very lonely place. The roar of the engine settles into a steady, reassuring hum, and the pilot is left alone with their thoughts, the physics of flight, and the weight of what just happened. Emily had 40 minutes of transit ahead of her. 40 minutes in a cockpit with no one to perform for, no threat to manage, and no orders to follow. It was just her and the cold, persistent question. Someone had known. She ran through the list of names in her head like a mantra. Morse, Rains, Okonkwo, Petty. Martinez knew she was flying, but he didn't know the route. Reeves and his team knew the extraction plan, but the approach corridor was a different compartment. The specific details, the canyon, the timing, the GPS waypoints, had been on the data drive Petty had handed her. Who had prepared that drive? Who had transmitted the plan to the staging base in Jalalabad? And then the thought she had been avoiding, the one that made her stomach turn. Who at Nellie's in the last 4 hours had made a phone call? She keyed her radio, shifting to the watchdog frequency. Watchdog, Viper lead, I need a favor. The controller answered immediately. He'd been monitoring her for the entire duration, and his voice sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for 90 minutes and had only just remembered to exhale. Go ahead, Viper lead. The unknown aircraft that engaged me, Emily said. You said no shoot was observed. I need you to run a full radar track playback on that aircraft. I need its complete flight path from the moment of first detection. I want to know where it came from, how long it was in the air, and what course it flew before it hit the intercept point. Can you get that data to General Morse's office within the hour? There was a long pause on the other end. That's a significant data request, ma'am. That's high-level telemetry. I know exactly what it is, Emily replied, her voice hardening. Can you do it? Yes, ma'am, the controller said, his tone shifting to one of professional compliance. It'll go to Morse's office. I'll flag it as priority one. Thank you, she said. She continued to fly, the vast, rugged expanse of the Hindu Kush passing beneath her. 20 minutes into the flight, her radio crackled again. This time, it wasn't the mission frequency. It was the Nellie's operations channel, a frequency usually reserved for base-level logistics, not long-range combat comms. Viper lead, this is Nellie's ops. The voice was young, sounding slightly stressed and out of breath. Emily didn't recognize it. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Viper lead, go ahead. Captain Carter, you are instructed to contact General Holt's office immediately upon landing. The general has been informed of the mission and requests your presence in his office within 15 minutes of wheels down. Emily looked at her altimeter. She was at 22,000 feet, moving at 420 knots. She thought about General Holt, the man in the service dress uniform, the man whose mask of professional indifference had cracked just enough for her to see the anger underneath. She remembered what Morse had told her. Holt would be informed only after she was already in the air. Copy, she said, her voice cool. Nellie's ops, please confirm. Has the mission outcome been communicated to General Holt? A brief hesitation followed. I don't have that information, ma'am. I was just told to relay the summons. Thank you, she said, and closed the frequency. She sat in the silence of the cockpit and let the implications sink in. Holt had been informed, and he wanted her in his office before she even stepped out of her flight suit. That meant someone had moved fast, faster than the official notification process would usually allow. Either Morse's office had notified him the second the mission was flagged as a success, which seemed unlikely given how carefully Morse had excluded him, or someone else at Nellie's had been watching. Someone had been monitoring the mission in real time and had picked up the phone the moment the smoke cleared. The name Dawson flickered in her mind, but she pushed it aside. She didn't have proof yet, and in her world, making an accusation without data was a fast track to professional suicide. She touched down at Nellie's at 16. The moment the wheels met the tarmac, a wave of exhaustion hit her. It wasn't the physical tiredness of a long day. It was a cognitive deflation, the body finally realizing that the period of maximum demand had passed. Her hands stayed steady on the controls as she taxied in, but it was a forced steadiness, maintained by sheer will rather than the natural flow she'd felt in the canyon. Martinez was waiting on the flight line. He stood back as she went through the post-flight shutdown procedures, but as soon as she climbed down the ladder, he was there. He looked at her face, then at the jet, then back at her. "Jet's clean," she said, her voice raspy from the recycled air. "I can see that," Martinez replied. He paused, looking like he wanted to say more, maybe ask about the missing ordnance or the soot on the fuselage, but he held back. He had the wisdom to know when a pilot needed to breathe. "Thank you for having her ready," she added. He just nodded. She pulled her helmet off, the hot, dry desert air hitting her skin like a physical weight. For a moment, she just stood there by the wing of the F-35, breathing the air of a world that didn't involve Mach speeds or missile locks. Then she tucked the helmet under her arm and began the walk toward the headquarters building. She didn't make it to the main briefing room. Colonel Rains was waiting for her just inside the doors, tucked into a small alcove near the entrance. It was a strategic position, shielded from the view of the duty officer's desk. "You're back," Rains said softly. "I'm back." The generals were extracted, both of them. Reeves had them off the ground in 80 seconds. A look of profound relief washed over Rains' face, the kind of relief that only comes when a person has been carrying a crushing weight for hours. "Good," she whispered. "That's good." Then her expression sharpened. "Holt knows. I heard," Emily said. "Who told him?" Rains pressed her lips together, her eyes darting toward the corridor. "That's what I need to tell you before you go in there. Walk with me." They moved down the hall, keeping their pace casual, but their voices low. Rains spoke in the clipped, economical sentences of an intelligence officer delivering a high-priority brief. 17 minutes after you went wheels up, the RA flagged an unauthorized access at the secure mission planning terminal in the intel section. The log showed a credential that shouldn't have been active. An officer who was supposed to be logged out for the day at 0800. Emily kept walking, her face a mask of neutrality, though her heart had begun to race. "Whose credential?" "The log shows Major Dawson's access code," Rains said. The words felt like a physical blow to Emily's chest. It wasn't shock. It was the sickening clarity of a suspicion being confirmed. It was the feeling of all the jagged pieces of the last month finally clicking into a single ugly picture. "Dawson," she repeated. "His code accessed the canyon approach data and the mission timing package," Rains continued. "The access lasted 4 minutes. 11 minutes after he logged out, the unknown aircraft that engaged you was already airborne from a private airfield in eastern Pakistan. We've identified the location. It's roughly 40 minutes from the canyon entrance." Emily stopped walking. She turned to Rains, her mind racing through the math. "Colonel, the timing. If Dawson accessed the data 17 minutes after I took off, and that bogey was in the air 11 minutes after that—" "I know," Rains said, her voice grim. "The aircraft would have had to be pre-flighted and ready to go before I even left the ground here at Nellie's," Emily said. "Dawson didn't trigger the intercept. He couldn't have. He confirmed the timing. The intercept was already planned. It was staged." Rains nodded slowly. "Yes, that is exactly what the timeline implies. The aircraft was already positioned, waiting for the green light. Dawson wasn't the architect. He was the signalman. He was telling someone that the mission was proceeding as planned. Which means whoever planned this knew you were going to fly before the Pentagon even made the official call." The coldness Emily had felt in the cockpit returned, deeper this time. It wasn't the cold of high-altitude flight. It was the chill of realizing just how deep the betrayal went. They were inside the process from the very beginning, before Morse called me, before you briefed me. She trailed off, her mind flashing back to the day her world had been turned upside down. "Before Holt grounded me," she said. The corridor was silent. Rains looked at her steadily. "Say that again." "The grounding," Emily said, the realization blooming in her mind. 31 days ago, Holt grounded me for the Syria mission. The review board was a sham, a way to make it formal. It made my movements predictable. I was stuck on base, isolated from operations. My schedule was fixed. I was a known quantity. Someone used that, Rains said. They knew exactly where you'd be and exactly how frustrated you'd be. They knew that if a high-stakes, off-the-books mission came up, you were the only one Morse would trust, and you were the only one who would be desperate enough to take it without asking too many questions. Emily leaned against the wall, the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on her. "Holt grounded me because I outflew Dawson 18 months ago," she said. "He did it to protect his golden boy's ego." Rains shook her head. "That might be the reason he gave himself, Emily. But in this world, a man's ego is just another tool. An angry, threatened man is a man who will make decisions that serve someone else's agenda without ever realizing he's being played. I'm not saying Holt is innocent. I'm saying that in the world of intelligence, a useful idiot is just as dangerous as a deliberate traitor." Emily absorbed that, turning the last month over in her mind. The fence, the cold coffee, the long hours watching the jets she should have been flying, it wasn't just bureaucratic spite. It was engineering. It was the preparation of the battlefield. "Where is Dawson now?" she asked. "Security took him into custody 40 minutes ago," Rains said. "General Morse issued the authority the moment the access log was cross-referenced with the mission timeline. He's being held pending a full investigation." "And Holt? Holt doesn't know about Dawson yet," Rains said. "He was told the mission was a success and he immediately demanded to see you." She paused, looking at Emily with a mixture of concern and warning. "You're walking into a hornet's nest, Captain. Holt is going to try to control the narrative. He's going to try to bury whatever happened out there before it can touch him." Emily straightened her flight suit, her expression hardening into the same mask she wore when she was hunting in the sky. "Let him try," she said. "I have the data, and I'm still the one who brought the packages home." The walk to General Holt's office felt longer than the flight back from Afghanistan. The headquarters building, usually a place of sterile military efficiency, now felt like a labyrinth of hidden agendas and shadowed corners. Every officer she passed, every clerk with a clipboard, felt like a potential observer. The trust that formed the foundation of military life had been cracked, and Emily could feel the structural integrity of her world groaning under the pressure. When she reached the outer office, Holt's executive assistant didn't even ask for her name. He just gestured toward the heavy oak doors. "He's waiting for you, Captain." Emily took a breath, centered herself, and pushed the doors open. The office was large, bathed in the amber glow of the late afternoon sun. General Holt was standing by the window, his back to the room, looking out over the flight line where the silhouette of an F-15 was taking off into the desert sky. He didn't turn around immediately. He let the silence stretch, a classic power move designed to make the subordinate feel small and defensive. Emily didn't bite. She stood at attention, her helmet still tucked under her arm, and waited. Finally, Holt turned. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp and filled with a simmering, defensive energy. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm told you had quite an afternoon. The mission was successful, General," Emily replied. "Both targets were neutralized and the packages were recovered safely." "I'm aware of the tactical outcome," Holt said, walking slowly toward his desk. "What I'm more concerned about is the operational deviation. I was informed, after the fact I might add, that you engaged an unidentified aircraft over the extraction zone. An aircraft that, according to initial reports, was a military-grade interceptor." "That is correct, sir. I was jumped at the canyon exit. The engagement was defensive in nature." Holt sat down, leaning back in his leather chair. "Defensive? And you chose to pursue a head-on engagement against an unknown contact in a sovereign airspace we are not officially operating in. Do you have any idea the kind of diplomatic firestorm you've just ignited? If that pilot was who I think he was, you've just handed our adversaries a propaganda victory on a silver platter." Emily felt a flash of anger, but she kept it buried. "The pilot fired first, General. He had a lock on the extraction helicopter. If I hadn't neutralized him, General Morse and General Petty would be at the bottom of a canyon right now." Holt waved a hand dismissively. "That's a matter of perspective, Captain. What isn't a matter of perspective is that you were grounded. You were under a formal flight restriction. And yet, I find out that you were spirited away in the middle of the night to conduct a high-risk mission without my authorization. With all due respect, sir, General Morse authorized the mission under the direct oversight of the Joint Chiefs. I was told you were informed. I was notified that a mission was underway," Holt snapped. "I was not told that my most problematic officer was the one behind the stick." Problematic, Emily thought. The word hung in the air like a foul odor. She looked at Holt, really looked at him, and she saw the fear behind the bluster. He wasn't worried about the diplomatic fallout. He was worried about the trail. He was worried about what an investigation into that unknown aircraft would find. "General," she said, her voice dropping into a calm, dangerous register. "While I was in the air, someone at this base accessed my mission telemetry. They used Major Dawson's credentials to leak my approach corridor to a waiting interceptor." Holt's face went momentarily pale, a flicker of shock crossing his features before he clamped down on it. "That's a serious accusation, Captain. One that sounds like the desperate rambling of someone trying to deflect from their own insubordination." "It's not an accusation, sir. It's a matter of record. Colonel Rains has the logs. Major Dawson is currently in custody." The silence that followed was absolute. Holt stared at her, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely. Emily saw the realization dawn on him. The realization that the useful idiot role Rains had described might have just run its course. I was not informed of Major Dawson's status," Holt said, his voice losing its edge. "I'm sure you weren't," Emily said, "but you'll be informed soon enough, along with the Pentagon investigators, who are going to want to know how a private airfield in Pakistan knew exactly when to launch a strike on a classified U.S. mission." She took a step forward, no longer standing at formal attention. "You grounded me to keep me out of the way, General. You wanted me isolated so I wouldn't see what was happening in your wing. You let Dawson play his games because he was loyal to you, and in return you let him compromise the most sensitive operation of the year." Holt opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet was made of sand. Emily didn't wait for him to recover. She turned and walked toward the door. As her hand touched the handle, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "I'm going to go get some sleep now, sir. I've had a long day, but I'd suggest you start looking for a very good lawyer, because when Morse finds out that his life was put on the line for a grudge and a promotion, he's not going to be nearly as polite as I am." She stepped out of the office and closed the door behind her. The hallway was empty, the late afternoon light casting long, dramatic shadows across the floor. Emily leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. The mission was over. The fight on the ground was just beginning, but for the first time in a month, she didn't feel like she was watching from behind a fence. She was back in the game. And this time, she wasn't just flying, she was hunting. As she walked toward the exit, she passed a window looking out over the airfield. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of her F-35, the ground crews already swarming over it, preparing it for its next flight. It looked cold and lethal under the hangar lights, a silent witness to everything that had happened in the shadows of the Afghan mountains. Emily Carter kept walking. She had a lot of work to do, and for the first time in a long time, she knew exactly where she was going. The truth was out there, buried in radar tracks and access logs, and she wouldn't stop until she had every piece of it. The canyon was behind her, but the path ahead was just as narrow and just as dangerous, and she was ready for every turn. The desert night began to settle over Nellie's, the temperature dropping as quickly as it had risen. Emily made her way to the locker rooms, each step feeling heavier than the last. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache in her joints and a mental fog that made it hard to focus on anything other than the rhythmic sound of her own boots. She stripped out of her flight suit, the damp fabric clinging to her skin. The hot shower that followed was the only thing that felt real, the steam rising around her, the water washing away the salt and the smell of the cockpit. She dressed in her ops, feeling like a different person than the one who had climbed into the jet hours earlier. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale, but there was a hardness there that hadn't been present before. The uncertainty of the last 30 days had been replaced by a grim, unwavering purpose. Leaving the locker room, she found Colonel Rains waiting for her in the hallway. Rains looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "Morse wants to see us," Rains said. "He's in the secure vault at the Intel Annex. He's seen the radar tracks." Emily nodded. "Let's go." They walked in silence through the darkened base. The night air was crisp, the stars beginning to poke through the thin desert atmosphere. When they reached the Intel Annex, the security was noticeably tighter. 2 MPs stood at the entrance to the vault, their faces stern and unyielding. They checked Emily's ID with a scrutiny that felt different tonight, not just a routine check, but a search for something hidden. Inside the vault, the air was cold and smelled of ozone and old paper. General Morse was sitting at a large conference table, surrounded by glowing monitors and stacks of classified folders. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Sit down, Captain," he said. Emily and Rains took their seats. Morse tapped a key on his keyboard, and a large screen at the end of the room flickered to life. It showed a map of eastern Afghanistan and Pakistan, overlaid with a series of jagged lines. "This is the radar playback you requested," Morse said. "We pulled the raw data from the watchdog feeds and cross-referenced it with our satellite sweeps." He pointed to a blinking red dot near the Pakistani border. "This is where your interceptor originated. It's a private strip, officially listed as a transport hub for a local mining company. But the telemetry tells a different story. That aircraft didn't just take off, it was vectored. It followed a precise, low-altitude flight path designed to keep it below our primary radar coverage until the last possible second." He paused, his eyes locking onto Emily's. "It was waiting for a signal, and we found it." He switched the screen to a data log. At 14:17 local time, a burst transmission was sent from a relay station near Jalalabad. It was an encrypted signal, but the metadata matches the mission timing package that was accessed here at Nellie's. "Dawson," Emily said. Morse nodded. "Major Dawson didn't just look at the files, he transmitted the coordinates. He gave them your exit point, your airspeed, and your estimated time of arrival. He sold you out, Captain. He sold all of us out." "Why?" Rains asked, her voice tight with anger. "Why would a decorated officer do something like this?" Morse leaned back, a shadow crossing his face. "Money, ego, we're still digging, but the preliminary findings suggest Dawson was deep in debt. He'd been playing the markets and losing big. Someone found out and gave him a way out. All he had to do was provide a few operational updates." "And Holt?" Emily asked. "How much did he know?" Morse sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "General Holt is a complicated case. We haven't found any direct evidence that he was involved in the transmission. But his role in grounding you, his insistence on pushing Dawson forward, his attempts to block our oversight, it all created the environment that allowed this to happen. Whether he was a willing participant or just a convenient tool, the result is the same." He stood up, walking over to the window that looked out into the hallway. "Holt has been relieved of command, effective immediately. He's being reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon pending a full board of inquiry. Dawson is headed for a general court-martial." He turned back to Emily. "You did your job, Captain. You did it under conditions that would have broken most pilots. You saved my life and you saved Petty's. I won't forget that." "Thank you, sir," Emily said. Morse looked at her for a long moment. Then a small, tired smile touched his lips. "Get some rest, Emily. You're back on the flight schedule starting tomorrow. I think we've had enough of you on the ground." As Emily walked out of the Intel annex, the weight that had been pressing down on her for a month finally began to lift. The night was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the base. She looked up at the sky, at the vast, infinite expanse of stars, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged there. The conspiracy wasn't entirely unraveled. There were still questions about who had paid Dawson, about the mining company in Pakistan, about the larger forces at play. But those were questions for another day. For tonight, the mission was over. The packages were safe, and Emily Carter was a pilot again. She walked toward her quarters, her shadow long and steady against the desert sand. The canyon had been a test, a gauntlet of rock and fire designed to break her, but she had come through it. She had threaded the needle, faced the hunter, and found the truth. The flight home had been long, but she was finally there. And as she reached her door, she looked back one last time at the flight line, where the lights of the hangars glowed like beacons in the dark. Tomorrow, she would be back in the cockpit. Tomorrow, the sky would be hers again. And this time, she'd be ready for whatever was waiting in the shadows. The room felt smaller than it had only 10 minutes prior, the air thick with the kind of silence that usually precedes a storm. Rains stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the harsh Nevada sun, but her focus was entirely on the woman sitting across from her. Emily Carter felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders, a physical burden that far exceeded the G-forces she had pulled in the canyon only hours ago. She watched Rains, waiting for the shoe to drop, knowing instinctively that whatever came next would change the architecture of her world. "Carter, I need to tell you something," Rains said, her voice dropping to a register that signaled the end of formalities. "Holt made a call this morning. It was right after you left for the flight line. He didn't use the secure channels or the encrypted tactical loops. He went through an unclassified commercial line, a simple landline out of his secondary office. That is the only reason it wasn't flagged by the automated systems immediately. We have the record of the call now, the digital footprint of the connection, but we don't have the audio. Not yet. Emily felt a cold prickle of electricity trace a path down her spine. She stared at Rains, her mind already racing through the implications, mapping out the betrayal like a flight path through enemy territory. "Who did he call?" she asked, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. "That is exactly what General Morse's office is burning the midnight oil to find out," Rains replied, her tone careful, measured, and stripped of any unnecessary emotion. "I want to be absolutely clear with you, Emily. Having a call record is not the same as having a signed confession. It isn't definitive evidence of treason or even involvement in the ambush. A base commander makes dozens of calls every day, but the timing, it's sitting at the very top of the list of things the investigation team is examining." The implication hung in the stagnant air between them, a heavy, jagged thing that Emily was not yet ready to touch. She needed more than just a suspicion. She needed the kind of certainty that only comes from staring the truth in the eye. If General Holt was more than just a useful idiot, more than just a man with a bruised ego who enjoyed making her life miserable, then the scope of the conspiracy was massive. If he was an active participant, then the mission she had just completed wasn't just a rescue. It was a miracle that she had survived it at all. The thought of it made her stomach turn. The idea that her commanding officer might have been the one to guide the blade toward her back was a darker reality than any she had faced in the cockpit. "I need to go into his office," Emily said, her voice firmer now, the shock beginning to crystallize into a hard, cold resolve. "I need to look at him." "I know," Rains said. She stepped away from the window, moving closer to Emily. "And you're going to give him exactly what he expects. You're going to walk in there and deliver a clean, professional debrief. You tell him about the mission details, the weapons employment, the extraction of the flag officers, and the outcome. You answer his questions truthfully. You don't deviate from the facts. But while you're talking, you watch his face. You look for the cracks." Rains paused, her expression turning grimmer. "And you record everything." Emily looked up, her eyes narrowing. Rains reached into her internal jacket pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming device. It was flat, matte black, and no larger than a standard thumb drive. It looked like a piece of office equipment, something you might use to store a PowerPoint presentation, but its purpose was far more lethal. This was authorized under the active counterintelligence investigation, Rains explained. General Morse signed the order 40 minutes ago. Every word spoken in that office will be recorded and transmitted directly to the investigation team in real time. This isn't just a memo, Emily. This is a wire. Emily reached out and took the device. It was still warm from the heat of Rains' pocket. As she held it in her palm, she felt the sheer gravity of what she was being asked to do. Walking into a commanding officer's office while wearing a wire authorized by the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was a line that most officers never even imagined existed. It was a betrayal of the chain of command, a fundamental breaking of the military's social contract. But then, she thought about the fence. She thought about the 31 mornings she had spent standing in the dirt, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching the jets she should have been leading roar into the sky. She thought about the silence of her grounding, the isolation of being cast out for the crime of saving lives. And most of all, she thought about General Holt's voice in that very first meeting, his face twisted in a mask of bureaucratic disdain. "I will not have a cowboy making me look incompetent," he had told her. The memory of that insult, of the sheer arrogance behind it, burned away any remaining hesitation. She stood up, her jaw set, and slid the recording device into her breast pocket, right behind her wings. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." Holt's office was located on the 3rd floor of the command building, a space designed to project power and order. Emily had only been there once before, on the day her world had been pulled out from under her. The day she was grounded. As she approached the elevator, she found herself unable to wait for the slow, mechanical whine of the lift. The energy in her limbs was too high, her heart rate elevated by a cocktail of adrenaline and anticipation. She took the stairs instead, her boots echoing against the concrete in a steady, rhythmic beat. When she reached the 3rd floor landing, she didn't rush through the door. She stopped. She stood there for exactly 5 seconds, eyes closed, breathing deeply. She organized her thoughts, pulling the mask of the professional soldier tight over her features. When she walked through those doors, she had to be the Captain Carter he expected, controlled, slightly defiant but ultimately subordinate, and giving absolutely nothing away. She pushed through the heavy oak doors and entered the outer office. She noticed immediately that there was a different aide sitting at the desk than the one she had seen weeks ago. The new man looked up, his expression neutral. "He's expecting you, Captain," he said, waving her through toward the inner sanctum. General Holt was behind his desk, still wearing his full service dress. The sight of him was jarring. He hadn't changed since she had seen him in the corridor hours ago. It meant he had come straight back to this room from wherever he'd been hiding and had remained there, brooding, waiting. He looked up as she entered, his face a masterpiece of unreadability. It was the kind of face a man wears when he is working very, very hard to ensure that not a single muscle twitches out of place. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "sit down." Emily took her seat, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. She felt the slight weight of the recorder in her pocket, a silent witness to the tension in the room. "I've been informed that the mission was a success," Holt began. He didn't look happy about it. He looked like a man reading a weather report he didn't agree with. "Both flag officers have been extracted. Minimal collateral footprint. Well done." He folded his hands on the desk, his fingers interlaced with a precision that felt rehearsed. "Congratulations," he added. The word landed with a dull thud. It wasn't the word itself that felt wrong, but the delivery. There was no relief in his tone, no satisfaction, none of the genuine emotion that any commander should feel upon learning that 2 4-star generals had been pulled from the jaws of a hostile compound. It was the congratulations of a man delivering a line in a play he didn't want to be in. It was hollow, a shell of a sentiment. "Thank you, sir," Emily replied, her voice as flat as his. "Tell me about the mission," Holt said. "I want the full picture." She began the debrief. She kept it clean, professional, and strictly sequential, the way she had been trained since flight school. She detailed the canyon approach, the specific weapons employment she had used to neutralize the perimeter defenses, and the extraction team's performance. She spoke with the practiced cadence of a pilot who had done this 1,000 times, but her eyes never left his face. She was looking for the micro-expressions, the tells that even a man of his rank couldn't fully suppress. She watched for the moment he leaned forward, the moment his pupils dilated, the moment her words caused a reaction that didn't align with the official narrative. When she reached the part of the story involving the unknown aircraft, she saw it. It was subtle, so subtle that anyone not specifically hunting for it would have missed it entirely. As she described the sudden appearance of the interceptor at the exit of the canyon, Holt's eyes flickered. They moved left, a brief, involuntary glance toward the encrypted phone sitting on the corner of his desk. It lasted less than half a second, but to Emily, it was as loud as a shout. He looked back at her immediately, his face regaining its stony composure, but the damage was done. She noted it and kept talking, her voice never wavering. When she described the moment she pulled the trigger and sent the unidentified jet spiraling into the ridgeline, she saw his jaw tighten. A muscle jumped in his cheek, a physiological response to information that clearly affected him on a personal level. He wasn't just hearing a mission report, he was hearing about the destruction of an asset. "An unidentified aircraft," Holt said after she finished, "in restricted airspace equipped with high-end military countermeasures." "Yes, sir," Emily confirmed. "And your assessment is that it was targeted specifically at you?" "Given the timing, the altitude, and the intercept geometry, yes, sir. It was positioned to catch me at my most vulnerable point, the exit of the canyon. I was low on fuel, coming off a high-stress engagement and boxed in by the terrain. That wasn't a coincidence, it was an execution. Which means," Holt said, speaking slowly as if he were weighing every syllable, "that someone knew your route. Someone provided the telemetry for that intercept." "Yes, sir, that is the only logical conclusion." Holt fell silent. He looked down at his folded hands, his brow furrowed in what appeared to be deep thought. Emily watched the silence work on him. In that stillness, she felt a wave of complete, quiet certainty wash over her. Rains had been right. This man was not just a bystander. He was drowning in his own secrets. She could see it in the way he managed his reactions, the sheer physical effort it took for him to sit still while his body tried to betray him. "Sir," Emily said, her voice perfectly level, cutting through the silence like a blade. "I'd like to ask you something directly." Holt looked up, his eyes sharp. "Go ahead." "When I walked past you in the corridor this morning, before I left for the flight line, did you make any calls after that encounter?" The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of thought. It was the silence of a vacuum. It lasted for 3 agonizing seconds. In that window of time, Emily watched Holt's face go through a rapid, internal sequence of calculations. She had seen this expression before on the faces of pilots who knew they had misjudged a landing and were deciding how to crash. He was assessing how much she knew, how much she was guessing, and what the risk of each possible lie would be. "I make calls every morning, Captain," he finally said, his voice regaining its authoritative edge. "That is the nature of commanding a base of this size. There are 1,000 moving parts that require my attention." "Of course, sir," Emily replied. "I meant specifically after our encounter. Given the time-sensitive nature of the mission and the fact that you were the only one who knew the exact window of my departure." "I don't believe that's relevant to your mission debrief," Holt snapped, his patience finally fraying. "No, sir," Emily said, standing up slowly. "You're right. It isn't." She looked at him, and for the first time in 31 days, she didn't feel like the subordinate. She didn't feel grounded. She looked at him with an expression that gave him absolutely nothing to work with, while the space between them filled with everything they were both refusing to say. In that room, on the record, the trap had been set. The recording device in her pocket had captured every hesitation, every flicker of his eyes, and every defensive note in his voice. General Morse's team was already dissecting it. "That'll be all," Captain Holt said, dismissing her with a sharp wave of his hand. "Yes, sir," Emily replied. She walked to the door, her hand gripping the frame, but something stopped her. A sudden, sharp impulse made her turn back. "General," she said. He looked up, his face a mask of annoyance. "The 12 soldiers in Syria," Emily began, her voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "The 2 generals in the Korangal Valley. I want you to know that when I made the decisions to go after them, both times, I wasn't thinking about protocol. I wasn't thinking about my career or my standing in this wing. I certainly wasn't thinking about what you would think of me." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I was thinking about the people who were going to die if I didn't act. I will always make that choice, sir, no matter what it costs me. I thought you should know that." Holt said nothing. His face remained a wall of granite, but Emily saw his hands. Still folded on the desk, his knuckles had turned white from the pressure. He was squeezing so hard his hands were shaking. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. In the corridor outside, she didn't stop until she had rounded the first corner. She leaned her back against the cool, painted cinderblock wall and let out a long, slow breath. It was a breath she felt like she had been holding for 31 days. The tension in her chest began to ebb, replaced by a strange, hollowed-out calm. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number, the secure channel Morse had established. There were only 3 words on the screen: "We got him." Emily read it twice, her heart hammering against her ribs. She typed back a single question: "Dawson or Holt?" The reply took 40 seconds to arrive, 40 seconds that felt like an eternity. "Both." The message continued. "Dawson's access log connects to an external handler. Holt's call this morning went to the same number. Investigation is active. You did well, Carter." Emily stood in the quiet hallway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and read the message again. Both of them. It wasn't just a single rogue actor or a man with a grudge. It was a synchronized effort. One man had used his position to ground her, to clip her wings and make her movements predictable, while the other had fed her mission data to a ghost aircraft waiting in Pakistan. 2 men, both serving inside the same system she had sworn to protect. 2 men she had passed in the hallways every day while she stood at the fence, watching the sky. She thought about General Walsh and General Park, who were likely on a medical transport right now, soaring over the Indian Ocean. They were alive because she had flown a canyon that 6 other pilots had crashed in during simulations. She thought about the pilot of that unknown aircraft, whoever they were, now nothing but debris on a Pakistani ridgeline. They had been sent there specifically to kill her. She reached into her pocket and touched the recording device. It was still warm. She pushed off the wall and started walking. Her footsteps were steady, even, and purposeful. It was the walk of someone who finally knew where the ground was. 31 days ago, she had walked out of this building feeling small. She had been reduced to a spectator in her own life. She had told herself that doing the right thing was its own reward, even if it cost her everything she loved. She had been right to believe that, but she realized now that the cost she had been paying wasn't an accident. It wasn't the unfairness of the universe. It had been a calculation. The grounding, the isolation, the cold coffee at the fence, it had all been a stage. Someone had built a theater around her, designed to control her, to observe her, and to see exactly what it would take to break her. They had written a script for her, but she had refused to play the part. And now the stage was on fire. The people who had built the trap were about to realize that you should never corner someone whose only home is the sky. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a voice call from Rains. Emily answered it before the first ring had even finished. "Where are you?" Rains asked, her voice urgent. "Third floor corridor," Emily said. "I just left Holt's office. Come to the secure room now. Morse is on the line and she wants to talk to you directly." There was a brief pause, a moment where the professional veneer of the intelligence officer slipped. "Carter, the investigation team just pulled the full radar track on that unknown aircraft." Emily stopped walking. "What did they find?" Rain's voice dropped to a whisper. "It didn't just come from Pakistan. We traced its flight path back. 4 days ago, that same aircraft flew a high-altitude pass directly over Nelly's. It was sitting above the commercial traffic lanes, no flight plan filed, completely dark." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Someone was running reconnaissance on this base," Rains continued. "On you specifically. They were tracking your flight patterns, your schedule, the layout of the flight line. They've been watching you for at least a week, maybe longer." Emily didn't respond immediately. She started walking again, her pace never changing, her face a mask of iron. Inside, something had shifted. A final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place, and the resulting picture was one of absolute, crystalline clarity. It was the same feeling she got when she was at 340 knots, 70 feet off the canyon floor, with the walls closing in on both sides. It was the focus of someone who had found the edge and realized they were built to live there. "I'm on my way," she said. The secure room felt different this time. It was the same windowless box, the same humming servers, and the same sterile smell of ozone and electronics, but Emily felt larger within it. She didn't feel the arrogance of a victor, but the grounded density of a person who had been tested to the breaking point and had held together. She sat down across from the secure terminal and picked up the handset. General Morse was already there, her voice coming through the line with a raw, direct quality that replaced her earlier caution. "The radar track is confirmed," Morse said, wasting no time on pleasantries. 4 days ago, an unregistered high-altitude aircraft flew a surveillance pass over Nelly's. The flight originated from the same Pakistani airfield as the one that engaged you today. Same operator network, same chain of command. "Carter, these people were not improvising. This wasn't a target of opportunity." Emily gripped the handset. What was the end goal? If the canyon was a test and I survived it, then what? "That's what we're digging into now," Morse replied. "But the working theory is recruitment, specifically forced recruitment. A pilot with your skill set, the ability to fly the canyon, the instinctive threat response, the willingness to operate outside of standard protocols. That is an asset that is worth an enormous amount to the right buyer." "Recruitment?" Emily asked, her voice flat. "By trying to kill me?" "It's a leverage play," Morse explained. "The plan appears to have been to document your capabilities in a live-fire scenario. If you failed, you were a threat neutralized. If you succeeded, they would have had high-resolution data on exactly what you could do. And they were building a file to ensure you had no choice but to do it for them." "Leverage," Emily repeated. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning they've been digging into your life for months. Your personal records, your family contacts, your financial history. They were looking for the pressure points, the kind of things that can be used to squeeze a person until they break. And Dawson was the one feeding them the raw material. He had total access to your personnel files through his position on Holt's staff." Emily's mind went back to the corridor that morning. She saw Dawson's face, heard the lightness in his voice as he told her she was going to get herself killed. She had thought it was just the petty jab of a man who didn't like her. She realized now it was the smug satisfaction of a man who knew exactly what was waiting for her in the dark. He knew about the intercept aircraft, Emily said. It wasn't a guess. He knew, Morse confirmed. His access to the mission data this morning wasn't about intelligence gathering. It was a confirmation signal. He was telling his handlers that you were in the air, that the mission was live, and that the timeline was active. What he didn't realize was that we were sitting on those access logs in real time. The second his credentials hit the terminal, Major Okonkwo flagged it. "I authorized the hold immediately." "How long have you been watching Dawson?" Emily asked. 6 weeks, Morse said. "We noticed an anomalous pattern in his data access around the same time the Koringal compound went active. The two timelines were too perfect to be a coincidence. We had to move slowly, Carter. If we had grabbed him too soon, the rest of the network would have gone dark, and we would have lost the chance to see the full scope of the operation. We needed them to act." A heavy silence followed. Emily let the weight of that statement sink in. "So you used me too," she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. Morse didn't flinch. "Yes," she said, "I will not lie to you. I needed you to fly that mission because the lives of those generals were real and you were the only one who could get them out. But I also knew that sending you would force the network to show its hand. It gave us the documented, real-time connection we needed to link Dawson to his handler. I told you this was a trap. I told you that you were the bait. I was honest about that from the start. You were," Emily admitted. "I want to ask you something," Carter Morse said, her voice softening just a fraction. "And I want the truth. If you had known the full scope of this, the recruitment plan, the file they were building, the fact that you were being watched at Nellie's, would you still have flown that mission?" Emily didn't even have to think about it. The answer was already there, buried in her bones. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because the generals were real," Emily said, her voice firm, "and because the canyon was flyable. I was the one who could do it. Everything else is just noise. The decision doesn't change because the context is ugly." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Moore spoke again, her voice held a note of genuine respect. "That is exactly why they picked the wrong pilot," she said. "They looked at your records and saw a cowboy. They saw someone who breaks rules. They thought that meant you were someone who could be bought or broken. They didn't understand that you don't break rules because you're reckless. You break them because you're loyal to something higher than a manual." Morse's tone shifted back to the clinical efficiency of a general. "Here is the current status. Dawson is in custody and is currently being interrogated. He's already starting to talk. His handler has been identified as a former DIA contractor who went private years ago and has been acting as a middleman for foreign interests. The Pakistani airfield is being dealt with through the proper diplomatic and kinetic channels. And General Holt?" Emily asked. "General Holt's call this morning went to a shell company connected to that same contractor network," Morse said. "We are reconstructing the audio as we speak. From what we've gathered so far, Holt wasn't a recruited asset in the traditional sense. He didn't have a handler like Dawson did. He wasn't being paid. Then why? Because he was arrogant," Morse said, her voice dripping with a cold kind of disdain. "He didn't know the full scope of the conspiracy. He thought he was just helping some private consultants who shared his low opinion of you. He thought he was just making sure your career ended in a way that wouldn't reflect poorly on him. He was a man who let his own resentment be used as a tool by people far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. He's being relieved of command as of 10 minutes ago. The news should have felt like a victory, but to Emily, it just felt like the closing of a door. The man who had grounded her, who had tried to bury her career, was gone. Not because he was a monster, but because he was small. "What happens now?" Emily asked. "Now we clean house," Morse said. "There are other nodes in this network, other people who thought they could use the military as their personal playground. We're going to find every single one of them. And as for you, Captain, General Walsh and General Park have already requested you by name for their formal debrief when they return to the States. I think you'll find that your grounding is officially over." "Thank you, sir," Emily said. "Don't thank me," Morse replied. "You earned the sky back yourself. Get some rest, Carter. You're going to need it." The line went dead. Emily hung up the handset and sat in the silence of the secure room for a long time. She thought about the 31 days of dirt and cold coffee. She thought about the way the F-22 had felt when she pushed it through the exit of the canyon, the way the air had screamed against the canopy. She stood up and walked out of the room, through the layers of security, and out into the main corridor of the command building. She walked past the offices, past the aides, and out through the heavy oak doors. She didn't stop until she was outside, standing on the tarmac of the flight line. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the Nevada sky in shades of bruised purple and burning orange. The heat was still radiating off the concrete, but a cool breeze was starting to kick up from the desert. Emily looked out at the rows of hangars, at the ground crews moving purposefully between the jets. She looked up at the vast, open expanse of the sky. It was the same sky she had watched for a month, but it looked different now. It didn't look like a taunt. It looked like home. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the recording device, and handed it to Rains, who had followed her out. "It's over," Emily said. Rains took the device and looked at it, then looked at Emily. "No," she said softly, "it's just starting. But at least now you're flying." Emily nodded. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to blink through the twilight. She wasn't thinking about Dawson or Holt or the people who had tried to trap her. She was thinking about the next flight. She was thinking about the way the world looked from 40,000 feet, where the lines on the map didn't matter, and the only thing that was real was the wind and the engines and the sheer, beautiful impossibility of being alive. She stood there until the sun had completely vanished, a pilot reclaimed by the air, waiting for the morning when she would finally leave the ground behind. For 31 days, she had been a ghost on her own base. Tonight, the ghost was gone. Tomorrow, she would be a storm. The silence in the room was heavy, a physical presence that seemed to pulse in time with the low hum of the secure communication equipment. Emily Carter sat motionless, the receiver pressed to her ear, listening to the voice of General Morse. It was a voice she had known for years, usually characterized by a brisk, no-nonsense authority, but now it sounded different. It was level-measured and carried the chilling weight of absolute finality. Morse was telling her the truth about the man who had held her career in his hands, the man who had systematically dismantled her life over the last 31 days. General Holt hadn't just made a mistake. He hadn't just been a victim of poor intelligence or a lapse in judgment. He had made the call. He had reached out and told someone who should never have known, that Emily was airborne. He had done it with full knowledge of the consequences, understanding that the information was being funneled into a network of shadows that operated far outside the light of the chain of command. Morse's voice didn't waver as he delivered the verdict. He spoke of cultivation, of the slow, patient way people like Holt are brought into the fold. They aren't bought with bags of cash in dark alleys. They are groomed. They are made to feel important, made to feel like they are the only ones who truly understand the stakes. Over time, they are led to believe that the decisions they are making are their own, even as the strings are being pulled by hands they never see. This, Morse explained, was not the behavior of an innocent man who had stumbled into a trap. This was the behavior of a man who had become a piece on a board he didn't even realize existed. Emily felt a strange, cold sensation settle in her chest. She asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment the recording device had captured Holt's confession. What happens to him? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, a moment where the vast, complex machinery of the Pentagon seemed to take a breath. Morse finally spoke, his tone shifting slightly. He told her that such decisions were above her pay grade, a standard military deflection. But then he continued. He informed her that the Secretary of Defense had been briefed. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the entire Joint Chiefs were now aware of the situation. In the world of flag officers, there is a very specific, very unforgiving view of those who pass operational information to unauthorized parties. It didn't matter what Holt believed he was doing. It didn't matter if he thought he was protecting the service or acting on some higher moral ground. He had broken the fundamental trust of his office. Morse let the silence hang for a beat before delivering the final blow. His career is over, Carter. Whatever else happens, whatever legal or military proceedings follow, the man who was General Holt no longer exists in any functional capacity. Emily sat with that for a long time. She had expected a surge of triumph, a sharp, jagged sense of satisfaction at seeing her tormentor brought low. She had imagined the relief of a wrong finally being corrected, the scales of justice tipping back into balance. But what she felt was quieter, more muted, and infinitely more complicated. It wasn't sympathy. She couldn't find it in herself to feel sorry for the man who had clipped her wings and left her to rot behind a perimeter fence. Instead, it was a profound recognition of the scale of the game. The machinery that had spent 31 days grinding her down, trying to turn her into a cautionary tale, had itself been caught in the gears of something much larger. Even Holt, with all his stars and his perceived power, had been nothing more than a tool. He had been moved across the board by hands he never saw, a victim of his own arrogance and the subtle manipulation of those who knew exactly which buttons to press. Then, she spoke the words that mattered more than any investigation or any general's downfall. "General," she said, "is my grounding officially nullified?" The response was immediate, stripped of any bureaucratic hedging. Morse told her that as of 1400 hours that day, the review board's findings were being expunged. Not just overturned, but erased. Her record would no longer show a disciplinary action for the Syria mission. Instead, it would be recorded as a commendation action. The bravery she had shown, the lives she had saved, were finally being recognized for what they were. Furthermore, her classification access was being upgraded. She was no longer just a pilot under a cloud of suspicion. She was an operational asset whose role in that day's mission had earned her a seat at the highest levels of the intelligence community. Morse's voice softened then, and for the first time, Emily thought she could detect the ghost of a smile through the digital encryption. He told her that General Walsh and General Park, the two men she had just pulled from the jaws of a lethal trap, had been briefed on their rescuer. Walsh, a man known for his bluntness and his fierce loyalty to those under his command, had reacted in exactly the way one would expect. Morse quoted him directly. Walsh had demanded to speak to Emily's commanding officer immediately. He wanted to talk about a promotion. Emily closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wall of the quiet room. The exhaustion of the last few hours, the last month, threatened to pull her under. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling. "I don't need a promotion," she said. "I need my flight status back." "You have it," Morse replied, effective immediately. The line went quiet again, but this time it wasn't a heavy silence. Emily could hear the distant, muffled sounds of the Pentagon in the background, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the sound of people moving through corridors. It was the sound of the world continuing to turn, of a massive, indifferent organization doing its daily work. The world was moving forward, and for the first time in 31 days, Emily Carter was moving with it. Morse had one last thing to say. He warned her that the coming weeks would be demanding. There would be investigations, depositions, and a painstaking reconstruction of the timeline. She would have to sit through technical debriefs about the canyon approach and the engagement, explaining every banked turn and every throttle adjustment at levels of classification that meant she could never speak of them to her peers. He asked if he could count on her. Emily didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Good," Morse replied. "Go get some rest, you've earned it." And then a final personal note: "Carter, well done, in every sense." The line went dead with a soft click. Emily set the handset back in its cradle and remained in the chair for a few minutes, letting the silence of the room wrap around her. Her hand strayed to the breast pocket of her flight suit. The recording device was still there, and it was still warm, a tiny, flat object that had carried the weight of a man's career and the truth of a conspiracy. She took it out and set it on the table, looking at it with a sense of disbelief. It seemed so small, so insignificant, yet it had been the lever that moved the world. It was already being handled by people who knew exactly how to use the information it contained. People who would follow the threads Holt had provided until the entire network was unraveled. She stood up, her joints protesting the sudden movement. When she stepped out into the corridor, she found Rains leaning against the wall, her arms crossed over her chest. Rains didn't say a word, but the question was written in the tension of her shoulders and the intensity of her gaze. "It's done," Emily said, her voice sounding raspy even to her own ears. Rains let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound relief. She asked about the others, about Dawson. Emily told her that he was cooperating. The network was being rolled up piece by piece. She paused, then added one more name: Holt. Rains nodded slowly, her expression darkening with a grim sort of understanding. "I had a feeling," she said quietly. "Not that it would turn out to be this, but I knew something was wrong." She looked at Emily, her eyes searching. "The grounding? It's lifted," Emily replied, effective immediately. A change came over Rains's face then. It wasn't a look of wild celebration or exuberant joy. It was something deeper, something more restrained and genuine. It was the look of a person who had witnessed a profound injustice being corrected and was allowing herself to feel the simple rightness of it. She didn't need to make it larger than it was. The fact itself was enough. "Good," she said simply. "That's good." They walked together toward the stairwell, their boots echoing on the linoleum. At the top of the stairs, Rains stopped and looked at Emily. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. Emily didn't have to think about it. The answer was as natural as breathing. "Sleep," she said, "then fly." Rains almost smiled at that. "In that order?" she asked. Maybe simultaneously, Emily joked, and then she turned and headed down the stairs. The flight line at Nellis Air Force Base in the mid-afternoon was a study in transition. The morning sorties had long since returned, their engines cooling in the dry desert air, and the afternoon schedule hadn't quite reached its peak. The tarmac had a peculiar quality during these hours, a sense of a place between things, not empty but not yet full, a giant machine taking a long, slow breath. Emily walked out through the main doors of the operations building and across the apron. The heat of the concrete radiated through the soles of her boots, and the sun beat down on her shoulders with a familiar, comforting intensity. The Nevada air moved across the base, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of aviation fuel and the distant, low-frequency rumble of the desert. She spotted Jet 6 immediately. Martinez was still there, a barrel-shaped man who had spent 16 years working on flight lines from Okinawa to Ramstein. He was performing a post-flight inspection, his movements methodical and thorough. He ran his hands over the fuselage of the F-35 with the kind of reverence usually reserved for living things. He loved the machines he worked on, and it showed in every turn of a wrench and every check of a hydraulic line. He looked up when he heard Emily's footsteps approaching, his expression unreadable behind his grease-stained cap. Emily stopped a few feet away from him. "Aircraft is clean," Martinez said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "Whatever you did out there, you brought her back in one piece." "That was always the plan," she replied. Martinez studied her face for a moment, his keen eyes picking up on the exhaustion and the subtle shift in her demeanor. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "It's over?" he asked. "The mission is over," she said. "The rest of it is going to take a while." She took a breath, looking at the man who had been one of her few allies during the long month of exile. "Martinez, the grounding is lifted." The crew chief went still. He didn't cheer and he didn't offer a celebratory remark. Instead, he did something Emily hadn't expected. This man from Albuquerque, who spoke mostly in maintenance codes and the occasional burst of profanity, put down the inspection cloth he was holding. He pressed his lips together very tightly and looked away, his eyes scanning the horizon. He stood like that for a full 3 seconds, fighting for control of his features. When he finally looked back at her, his voice was slightly rougher than usual. "Well," he said finally, "about time." "Yeah," Emily agreed, her own voice thick with emotion. "About time." She stood beside Jet 6 for a long moment. This was her aircraft, the machine she had demanded Martinez have ready on 2 hours' notice. It was the machine that had carried her through a jagged canyon at 340 knots, responding to every twitch of her fingers with predatory grace. It had brought her back clean, and now it sat resting in the sun. Emily reached out and placed her hand flat against the fuselage. The metal was warm, soaking up the desert heat. Through her palm, she could feel the very faint, dying vibration of the recently worked engine, the resonance of a machine that had given everything it had and was now settling into a deep, well-earned rest. She understood that feeling perfectly. Every cell in her body was echoing that same exhaustion, that same sense of a task completed. She left the flight line and made her way to the pilot-ready room. It was a utilitarian space, filled with lockers, benches, and the faint scent of stale coffee and flight suits. She sat down on one of the benches, intending only to rest for a moment, but the second her back touched the wall, her body staged a coup. She was asleep almost instantly, a deep, absolute plunge into unconsciousness that was non-negotiable. She slept for 4 hours without dreaming, without stirring. It was the sleep of extreme physical and psychological expenditure, the kind of rest that only comes when the fight is finally over and the adrenaline has finally drained away. When she woke, it was 6:47 in the evening. The ready room was dim, the harsh overhead lights dimmed to a low evening setting. Outside, the base was transitioning into its night routine. Emily sat up, feeling a momentary sense of disorientation. She ran a quick internal inventory. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. The crushing weight of the exhaustion had broken like a fever, leaving her feeling light and strangely renewed. She noticed a folded piece of paper sitting on the bench beside her. In a world defined by digital communication, a handwritten note was an anomaly, something that demanded immediate attention. The handwriting was precise, slightly formal, the script of someone who had been taught to write in an era when penmanship was a reflection of character. She opened the note and began to read. "Captain Carter," it began, "I have been informed of today's events in their full scope. I owe you an apology that I am not certain I am capable of delivering adequately, but I will attempt it anyway. What I did in grounding you was wrong, not because of the outcome, but because I allowed personal considerations to override my professional judgment, and because in doing so, I made myself useful to people whose intentions I did not understand and would not have endorsed. I do not expect your forgiveness. I am not sure I deserve to ask for it. What I can tell you is that whatever the investigation determines about my culpability, I know what I did and I know what it cost you, and I will carry that. I am told your grounding has been lifted and your record corrected. It should never have needed correcting. It was signed, General Holt." Emily read the letter twice, her eyes tracing the sharp lines of the ink. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her breast pocket, the same pocket that had held the recording device earlier that day. There was a strange, haunting symmetry to it. That small patch of fabric had carried first a wire and then a confession, both of them in their own way instruments of the truth. She didn't know how she felt about the letter, and she suspected she wouldn't know for a very long time. It didn't change the fact that he had betrayed his uniform. It didn't give back the 31 mornings she had spent standing at the perimeter fence, watching other pilots take to the sky. But it was real. It was an admission of failure from a man who had lost everything, an attempt to salvage some small piece of his soul from the wreckage of his career. She respected the reality of it, even as she understood its limitations. She stood up and stretched, feeling the stiffness leave her muscles. She walked over to the window and looked out at the sky. The evening over Nellie's was spectacular. Nevada skies in that final hour before darkness have a way of being excessive, of showing off colors that seem almost too vibrant to be real. Deep purples bled into fiery oranges and bruised golds, the kind of sunset that makes people who have never seen the desert think a photograph must be filtered. For 31 days, she had watched this sky from the wrong side of the fence. She had told herself every day that the sky was still beautiful, that it didn't change just because she wasn't in it. She had tried to believe that, but in her heart, she had known it was a lie. The sky was different when you were part of it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Okonkwo, typically brief and to the point. Walsh and Park are stable. Walsh wants to meet you when he's out of medical, says he has a proposition. Emily stared at the screen for a moment. A proposition from a 4-star general whose life she had saved. She thought about what that might mean. The doors that had been slammed shut and locked over the last month were not just being reopened. They were being replaced by new ones she hadn't even considered. The people who had tried to destroy her career were gone, replaced by those who now owed her a debt that could never truly be repaid. She typed a short reply, "Tell them I'll be there." She put the phone away and took one last look at the fading light. Then she turned and walked out of the ready room. She moved down the corridor, her pace quickening, and pushed through the exterior doors. The evening air was cooler now, but the sound of the flight line was louder. She could hear the engines cycling, that distinctive, rising whine that she had heard every morning from behind the fence. But now she wasn't standing apart from it. She was walking toward it. The difference between those two things, between being an observer and being a participant, was too large for words. It was something that had to be lived. She found the duty flight officer in his small, glass-walled office. Without a word, she showed him the nullification order on her phone, the official document from Morse's office that listed her name, her service number, and the exact time the grounding had been lifted. The duty officer read it, his eyes flicking between the screen and Emily's face. He didn't know the story. He didn't know about the canyon or the conspiracy or the wire. He just saw a pilot and a valid order. "Welcome back, Captain," he said with uncomplicated sincerity. "Thank you," Emily replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. She walked out to Jet 6. Martinez had been busy. The aircraft had been refueled, a full post-mission inspection had been completed, and the logs had been signed off. It was fully flight-worthy. Hanging from the cockpit access ladder was a small, handwritten note on a piece of yellow tape. "She's ready when you are." Emily smiled, a genuine, private moment of joy. She climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The space was familiar, a high-tech cocoon that she knew as well as the layout of her own home. She began the pre-flight checks, her hands moving with the automatic fluency of 900 hours of experience. Every switch, every dial, every digital readout came back clean. Green lights across the board. When the checks were finished, she sat for a moment in the silence before startup. She placed her hands flat on her knees and took a long, slow breath. Her mind drifted back over the events that had brought her to this moment. She thought about Syria, the 12 soldiers who were alive because she had ignored the flight manual and dropped to 400 feet for those 2 desperate passes. She thought about the canyon, the sheer walls of rock blurring past at 340 knots, and the way the world had narrowed down to nothing but physics and instinct. She thought about the fence, the cold coffee, and the quiet desperation of those 31 days of exile. She thought about Holt's letter in her pocket and the weight of Morse's praise. She thought about Dawson, too. He wasn't a monster. He was a man whose pride had been wounded, and that wound had been exploited by people who understood human weakness with the cold precision of a master locksmith. They hadn't hated him. They had simply known how to turn him into a tool. She didn't hate him either. What she felt for him was something in the gray area between pity and contempt. He would spend the rest of his life in the silence of a prison cell or an interrogation room, reliving his choices and calculating exactly what his grievances had cost him. He had traded his honor for a chance to get even, and he had lost everything in the bargain. She wouldn't resolve her feelings about Holt tonight either. That was a project for another time. Tonight there was only one thing that mattered. She reached out and started the engine. The F-35 roared to life, a building crescendo of power that she felt deep in her chest. It was a visceral, physical connection. The aircraft didn't care about her history. It didn't know about the grounding or the betrayal. It only knew the touch of the pilot behind the stick, and it responded with a surge of ready energy. She taxied out toward the runway. The tower cleared her immediately, and even in the controller's voice, she heard that same simple welcome. "Welcome back, Captain." She was being greeted in the only language the flight line truly spoke: clearance, altitude, and heading. She rolled onto the runway and lined up with the center stripe. She pushed the throttle forward, feeling the massive thrust of the engine press her back into her seat. The acceleration built rapidly, a blurring of the desert landscape on either side of the runway. At the exact moment the wheels left the ground, Emily felt the shift. It was a wordless, fundamental sensation, the feeling of being returned to the element she was designed for. This time it wasn't complicated by the terror of a mission or the weight of a conspiracy. This time it was pure. She pulled back on the stick and let the aircraft climb, the nose pointing toward the darkening sky. The base fell away beneath her. The operations building, the ready room, and the perimeter fence all shrank until they were nothing more than toys on the desert floor. The frustrations, the anger, and the betrayals fell away with them. Up here, there were no fences. There were no grounding orders or angry generals. There were no recording devices and no traps. There was only the honest, ancient transaction between a machine and the air, and the person who knew how to make that transaction work. She leveled off at 12,000 feet and turned toward the horizon, where the last sliver of the sun was disappearing. She thought about the network in the mountains of Afghanistan, being dismantled piece by people who now had everything they needed. They had built a trap for her, studying her files and her movements with clinical precision. They had tried to use her own nature against her, and she had flown through it all, not because she was reckless, but because she followed a set of rules that were older and more authoritative than any bureaucratic order. Her rules were written in physics and instinct and the absolute value of human life. Emily Carter was 25 years old. She had 900 hours in the most advanced fighter jet in the world. She had saved lives in 2 different theaters of war, shot down an assassin, and outmaneuvered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon. She had been grounded, and she had fought her way back to the sky as if nothing had ever happened. Because in the end, nothing was enough to keep her down. She pushed the throttle forward, chasing the last of the light into the infinite Nevada evening. The sky was wide, clean, and absolutely without limits, and Emily Carter flew.